This is where awareness becomes transformation, not by altering everything at once, but by observing one inhale at a time. Each breath becomes a checkpoint, a reflection, and slowly those small moments of noticing begin to interrupt the bigger habits of unconscious tension. Breath also reveals how you relate to stillness. If the body resists a slow breath, it may be resisting calm. If the exhale feels foreign, it may be a sign that letting go has been avoided. These aren't just physical reactions, they are messages. Noticing them doesn't mean analyzing every breath. It means staying close enough to feel when the breath speaks clearly, and trusting that what it reveals is worth listening to. Sometimes the breath feels blocked, not by physical illness, but by something unspoken. A grief that hasn't surfaced, a decision that hasn't been made, a fear that hasn't been met. And the moment attention lands there, gently, without judgment, space starts to open. Not because the breath was forced to deepen, but because the body was given permission to release. This is how the breath clears the mind, not by force, but by honesty. Each breath that's met fully is a reset. It signals safety to the nervous system. It breaks the momentum of restless thought. And over time, it trains the body to stop preparing for war when there is none. It teaches presence, not as a concept, but as a sensation. And presence has a breath pattern too. It's slower, softer, unforced. Not because you're trying to breathe deeply, but because the mind is no longer interrupting the body's rhythm. The breath starts to move on its own, with ease, and that ease spreads, not just in the chest, but in thought, in posture, in how you hear and see and speak. This is why monks and practitioners throughout history have placed breath at the center of awareness training. Not because it's mystical, but because it's the most accessible gateway to the present moment. It's always with you, always moving, always true. And the breath doesn't just reveal inner tension, it can also untangle it. By simply watching the inhale and the exhale without changing them, the nervous system begins to settle. That stillness makes it easier to see the next thought clearly, to respond with patience, to listen fully. Not because you learned a new technique, but because you removed the noise that was in the way. And the more this practice continues, the more the breath becomes a friend, a quiet guide. You begin to check in with it throughout the day, not as a ritual, but as a conversation. You feel it shift when a lie wants to be told. You notice it hesitate when fear begins to rise. You feel it expand when truth is spoken. These small signals become a map, not just of where you are, but of how to return to yourself when you drift. There's no need for perfect technique. No breath pattern is better than another. What matters is attention, presence, the willingness to pause and feel, to be honest with what the breath reveals, and to let it shift in its own time. This is real-time clarity, the kind that doesn't come from thinking harder, but from breathing closer, noticing sooner, trusting deeper. And the result isn't just a calm mind, it's a clear life, one breath at a time. So as you rest here, stay with the breath. Let it speak, let it reflect, let it soften whatever still feels tight. And remember, there's nothing to fix, nothing to control. The breath isn't a tool to make things better, it's a mirror to help you see things as they are. And in that seeing, peace begins. Clarity doesn't have to be far away. It's already flowing through your nose and rising in your chest. You just have to feel it. Now that the breath has been revealed as more than air, as a mirror reflecting the shape of your thoughts and the truth of your inner state, another layer begins to unravel. You've seen how presence lives in the body, how the mind quiets when it listens instead of speaks, and how real-time awareness softens tension without force. But beneath even the breath, beneath every habit and emotion, there's something deeper that quietly shapes how you see the world. And most people never question it, because it feels like the very foundation of who they are. Yet, it's exactly this that clouds so much of what could be clear. It's time to explore the concept that feels the most solid, but is actually the most fluid: the self. Every thought, every plan, every reaction is almost always wrapped in one assumption: that there is a fixed I behind it all. I feel this. I need that. This is happening to me. The problem isn't that the word I is used. The problem is that it's believed to point to something unchanging. Buddhism calls this illusion of a solid self anatta, non-self, not to deny experience, but to free it, because the more tightly identity is held, the more reality gets distorted. Mental confusion often begins with the belief that thoughts belong to a permanent self. But what happens when that belief is loosened, not as a philosophy to memorize, but as a practice to feel? The moment awareness sees that I is not a fixed thing, but a fluid process, perception begins to change. Thoughts stop feeling so personal. Emotions stop feeling like proof of who you are. And in that spaciousness, a different kind of peace arises. The self isn't a problem because it exists. It's a problem because it's clung to. It's seen as central, stable, enduring. But if attention slows down enough, it becomes obvious that self is just a story stitched together from memories, preferences, fears, and hopes. When those shift, the story shifts too. But rather than noticing the shift, most minds fight to maintain the illusion of consistency. And that fight creates suffering. Take anger, for example. When anger arises, the thought may come, "I am angry." But that statement fuses identity with the emotion. What if instead it's just anger is present? That small shift creates space. It removes the I from the feeling. It allows the emotion to be seen as temporary, not as something defining the whole being, but as a weather pattern passing through awareness. This shift isn't cold or disconnected, it's compassionate. Because when the illusion of self is softened, there's no longer a need to defend every opinion, justify every mood, or win every argument. The need to be right weakens. The fear of being wrong loses its edge. The mind becomes more curious, less reactive, because there's no longer a rigid me to protect. This is where mental clarity begins to sharpen. When the self isn't the center of every story, everything opens up. Listening becomes easier because you're not just waiting for your turn to speak. Apologizing becomes lighter because it no longer feels like an attack on identity. Growth becomes possible because change no longer feels like losing yourself. The belief in a fixed self also drives comparison. Am I better than them? Do I measure up? What does this say about me? These questions don't lead to clarity. They lead to exhaustion. Because the more the mind tries to maintain or improve a fictional I, the more divided it becomes. The more it splits attention between performing and actually being. But when the illusion is seen through, even briefly, the energy used to defend the self becomes available for something else: connection, presence, kindness. The mind stops looping around itself, and in that stillness, there's space to truly see. This is why Buddhist meditation doesn't just focus on calming the mind. It investigates the nature of the self, not to destroy the person, but to reveal what's not necessary. To see that the one who suffers the most, the one who resists, who clings, who fears, is not a solid thing, but a pattern. And patterns can be seen. Seen clearly, they begin to dissolve. Even the voice in the head, the one narrating every moment, isn't the self. It's just another arising in awareness. It may use the word I, but it's no different than a sound or sensation, just more content. The suffering begins when that voice is believed without question. But when awareness steps back and observes it, that voice becomes just another thing happening, not who you are, just something you're witnessing. And this doesn't erase personality. It refines it. You still have preferences, experiences, memories, but they stop owning you. You stop building identity out of them, and that frees you to respond more naturally, more openly, more wisely. Attachment to self also creates tension around failure. If something doesn't go well, it becomes a threat to identity. I failed becomes I am a failure. But when the I is loosened, failure becomes information, not identity. Something to learn from, not something to fear. The same is true with success. When success defines the self, it creates fear of losing status, approval, or meaning. But when I is seen as a passing role, success becomes lighter. Gratitude replaces pressure, presence replaces performance, and clarity flows more easily because there's less to protect. Even spiritual practice can become tangled in self. The desire to be seen as wise, calm, enlightened. But true clarity doesn't need to be seen. It's not about becoming a better I. It's about seeing through the need to be one at all. And in that letting go, practice becomes freedom instead of a goal. This also changes how suffering is held. When identity clings to pain, the pain multiplies. It becomes my sadness, my trauma, my anxiety. And that attachment strengthens the grip. But when sadness is simply seen as sadness, not as a personal defect, there's room for healing. Because healing doesn't require the story, it requires space. Anatta is not nihilism. It doesn't deny your existence. It points out that what you think you are is always changing. And fighting that change creates confusion. Embracing it creates peace. Because when the mind lets go of the need for a permanent identity, it stops struggling to hold on to every thought or push away every challenge. And that stillness clears perception. Even meditation shifts when self is released. It becomes less about me trying to focus and more about awareness resting in itself, less about progress and more about presence, less about achievement and more about seeing clearly what's here. This is what non-self clarity brings, a mind that no longer needs to be someone in order to be at peace, a heart that no longer needs to hold a fixed role in order to love, a presence that no longer depends on identity to be stable. So now, let the sense of I loosen. Let it be less sharp, less rigid, just another process, just another arising. There's no need to eliminate it. Just stop holding it so tightly. Let identity breathe. Let it move. Let it rest. Because the more space there is around the self, the clearer everything else becomes. You're not disappearing. You're finally seeing. Now that the self has been seen for what it is, not a fixed entity, but a flowing process, not a core identity, but a passing pattern of thought and memory, there's something else that begins to loosen its grip. When there's less pressure to protect a permanent me, the mind starts to reveal another of its subtle traps. A habit that seems harmless, even rational, but quietly fuels restlessness, tension, and internal clutter. The need to complete every thought, the hunger for mental closure, the obsession with finishing what was never required to be finished. That's where this next lesson begins. There's a discomfort that creeps in when a thought is left hanging, a question without an answer, a sentence without an ending, an idea that rises and then fades before being resolved. For most people, that discomfort doesn't feel optional. It feels like a signal to dig deeper, think harder, find the conclusion. But Buddhism points to something more subtle and more freeing, the ability to let the thought remain incomplete, to let it dissolve without having the last word, to walk away before the loop is closed. This may feel small, but it changes everything. Because most mental noise comes not from what's felt, but from what's pursued. The mind wants completion. It wants a clean exit. But life rarely offers that. Conversations end abruptly. Plans fall through. Relationships change without closure. And if the mind has never learned to sit with the unfinished, it tries to resolve the chaos by rehearsing, replaying, imagining, fixing, thought after thought, scene after scene. The loop never ends. But what if ending the loop isn't about solving the thought? It's about dropping the need for it to be solved. Letting an unfinished thought go is not the same as ignoring it. Ignoring is pushing away. Letting go is watching it rise, then not holding it. It's not a suppression. It's a soft exhale, a whisper of trust that says, this doesn't need to be completed to be complete. This is where mental lightness begins, because when thoughts are allowed to remain open, the mind becomes more spacious, like pages left blank instead of filled with hurried scribbles. And that space isn't empty, it's clear, it's peaceful. It becomes a field where awareness can rest instead of run. There's a story the mind loves to tell, that peace will come when everything is understood, every conversation sorted, every memory resolved, every loose thread tied. But what that story forgets is that the act of grasping is what creates the tension. The pursuit of closure becomes the very reason it can't be found. So much of mental suffering is about loops. Loops of thinking, loops of replaying, loops of preparing, correcting, analyzing. And every loop starts with a thought that feels unfinished. Why did they say that? What if I had done it differently? I need to figure this out. The thought arises. It opens, and the mind enters. It walks the maze, hoping for an exit. But the exit only appears when the need to exit drops. Clarity doesn't always come from finishing the thought. Sometimes it comes from noticing the need to finish it and choosing not to follow. That's the power of recognition. You notice the start of the loop, and instead of stepping in, you pause. You feel the urge to just think it through a little more, and instead you breathe. You don't resist the thought, and you don't dive into it. You let it float by. And something amazing happens when this is practiced. You realize how many thoughts were never yours to finish. They were just echoes, scripts from the past, imagined futures, thoughts that didn't need closure, They needed to be seen and released. This doesn't mean you stop thinking. It means thought becomes a tool, not a trap. You can still reflect, still solve problems, but the obsession with wrapping every idea in a bow begins to dissolve. You stop treating your mind like a courtroom that has to settle every case. You stop demanding that life provide you with perfect conclusions. Letting unfinished thoughts go is also an act of trust. Trust that peace doesn't need explanation, that presence is enough, that wisdom can rise in the space thought leaves behind. This is why, in many meditation traditions, when a thought arises, the instruction is not to follow it, but to return. Return to the breath. Return to the body. Return to now. Not because the thought is bad, but because it doesn't need to be finished to be released. Sometimes, the most healing response to a painful memory isn't understanding it. It's no longer needing to keep revisiting it. Sometimes, the most liberating answer to a question is realizing that the answer might not matter. This isn't passivity, it's perspective. It's the mind stepping out of its own way. And over time, as this practice deepens, the inner atmosphere changes. You begin to notice how quickly the mind wants to latch on, and you learn to smile at it, to breathe, to let the sentence trail off. And in that trailing off, clarity appears, not because something was resolved, but because something was released. There is a freedom in the unfinished, a softness, a lightness. Thoughts come, they open, they dissolve, and you don't have to carry everyone to the end. You're not a thought-finishing machine. You're awareness, spacious, alive, capable of choosing which paths are worth walking and which are just distractions wearing the mask of importance. Even now, as you rest, you may notice a thought lingering, a sentence your mind wants to complete, a scenario it wants to rehearse. Let it be there. Don't chase it. Don't banish it. Just watch it move. And when it begins to fade, let it fade. That's the letting go, not a push, not a fight, just a decision to not hold. And in that simple choice, your mind learns something life-changing. Not every thought is a problem to solve. Not every question is a door you have to open. Not every word needs to be followed to the end. The mind can rest in the unfinished. And sometimes that's where the deepest clarity lives. Now that the mind has begun to loosen its grip on the need to finish every thought, now that you've seen how peace can arise not from wrapping things up, but from letting them drift away without answers, something else comes into focus. Something quieter, but constant. Not a single thought, not a feeling, but a voice that doesn't shout, yet rarely rests. A voice that narrates every moment like it's writing a story no one asked for, and most don't even notice it's there. That's where the next shift begins, in recognizing the inner narrator and gently stepping back from its endless commentary. There's a voice in the mind that speaks even when there's nothing to say. It explains, it critiques, it compares, it replays conversations and writes imaginary ones. It narrates your walk to the kitchen like it's a documentary. He reaches for the glass. He's probably dehydrated. He always forgets to drink water. It doesn't matter what you're doing. The narrator is describing it, analyzing it, judging it, and spinning it into a story. The voice doesn't wait to be invited. It just speaks. And when it speaks, it builds a world, not just of language, but of belief. And those beliefs shape your experience more than you realize. The inner narrator isn't dangerous because it speaks. It's dangerous because it's believed. Its stories become identity. Its judgments become truth. Its scripts become the lens through which you see yourself, others, and the world. But that lens is not neutral. It's tinted with your past, your fears, your hopes, your insecurities. And when that's what shapes your perception, clarity can't land. Because you're no longer seeing life, you're seeing the narrator's version of it. This voice is often subtle. It doesn't always sound harsh. Sometimes it pretends to be helpful. I just need to think this through. I'm being realistic. I'm preparing for every outcome. But what it's really doing is keeping you out of the moment. It's keeping you in a loop where presence is never quite reached because the story hasn't finished. And it never finishes. Because the narrator is never satisfied with just being. It always wants something to add, something to explain. The Buddhist path doesn't ask you to destroy this voice. It asks you to see it for what it is, a process, not a person, a mental habit, not a master. You don't have to argue with the narrator. You don't have to agree with it. You just have to recognize that it's speaking, and you don't have to follow. This is where awareness becomes freedom. When you hear the voice say, "I can't believe she said that," or "Why am I always like this?" or "If I don't fix this, everything will fall apart," you pause. You step back. You notice that these are not facts. They are sentences, narratives, noise. And in the space between hearing them and reacting to them, you reclaim clarity. The mind loves stories. It turns every event into a script, every silence into a suspicion, every mistake into a moral. But the deeper truth is that stories are optional. Life continues with or without them. The breath moves, the body sits, the world turns. You don't need a narrator to validate what's already happening. You don't need a mental voice to explain your existence. You're already here, and that's enough. The more often this voice is seen, the softer it becomes. It doesn't disappear overnight. It may still comment, still worry, still dramatize, but its volume fades, its urgency weakens, and most importantly, its grip on your attention loosens, because you've stopped living inside the story and started resting in what's underneath it, stillness. This stillness isn't something you create. It's something that appears when the narrator steps aside. It's there, in the silence between sentences, in the pause after a thought ends, in the breath that's not being described. It's the space that the voice has been covering up. And when that space is entered, even for a moment, something radical is felt. Your experience is enough without commentary. Without the narrator, you begin to feel life directly. The warmth of the sun isn't a poetic metaphor. It's just warmth. A moment of eye contact isn't a signal of anything. It's just connection. The taste of food isn't judged. It's just tasted. Life becomes less about what it means and more about what it is. And what it is always changing. The narrator tries to freeze it, to explain it, to label it. But life doesn't follow those rules. It moves, it pulses, it surprises. And when you meet it without the middleman of mental narration, you meet it fully, not through the lens of who you think you are, but through the truth of what you're actually experiencing. This isn't detachment. It's intimacy, because stories create distance. The narrator stands between you and the moment. But when you step behind the narrator, the space collapses. There's nothing between you and what's happening. And that closeness isn't overwhelming, it's liberating, because it's real. Even emotional pain shifts when the narrator quiets. Sadness doesn't need a cause, it can just be felt. Fear doesn't need a prediction, it can just be held. You no longer need to explain your feelings to yourself, you just need to be with them. And in that being with, the emotion moves. It changes, it passes, but the story would have kept it spinning. This is why meditation often becomes less about technique and more about noticing the narrator, watching the voice rise, feeling the urge to follow it, and gently choosing not to, over and over. And with each choice, the voice loses power, not because you silenced it, but because you stopped fueling it. And yes, the narrator will try to convince you it's necessary. If I don't think about this, I'll forget it. If I don't prepare, I'll fail. If I don't explain myself, they won't understand me. But the truth is, most of what the voice says is repetitive, redundant, reactive. It's not new information, it's recycled content. And once you see that, you begin to realize that peace isn't the absence of thoughts. It's the absence of needing to believe every one of them. This doesn't mean you never think again. It means thinking becomes conscious, chosen, invited. And when thought is used like that, it becomes useful, creative, clear. But when the narrator runs wild, clarity is impossible because you're too busy performing the story to see the moment. So now, let the voice be. Let it speak, but don't grip it. Don't follow it. Don't become it. Just hear it and stay where you are. Stay in the breath. Stay in the body. Stay in the presence that doesn't need to narrate itself to feel real. Because underneath the voice, there's stillness. And inside the stillness, there's clarity. And with clarity, there's nothing left to explain. Only peace. Now that the voice inside has been exposed, not as truth, but as narration, not as identity, but as noise dressed up as guidance, something else is starting to settle. The space that once felt unfamiliar is becoming a little more comfortable. The need to explain is softening. The chase for mental conclusions is slowing down. And in that slowing, something rare begins to surface. A way of seeing that doesn't depend on approval, on agreement, or even on control. A kind of perception that doesn't need to be emotionally charged to be deeply clear. This is where equanimity begins, not as indifference, but as the quiet strength to see without being shaken. Equanimity is one of the most misunderstood words in Buddhist practice. Many think it means not feeling. They hear non-reactivity and assume it's a dullness, a kind of emotional numbness. But in truth, equanimity is one of the most alive states the mind can enter. It's not the absence of feeling, it's the presence of steadiness. It's not shutting down, it's staying open without falling over. In day-to-day life, the mind reacts to almost everything. A compliment lifts you, a criticism drops you, a delay frustrates you, a text excites you. This roller coaster isn't just exhausting, it clouds perception. It turns neutral moments into problems and meaningful ones into addictions. The moment the mind is hooked by reaction, clarity fades. Because now you're not seeing what's happening. You're seeing your response to it. Equanimity interrupts this pattern. It allows the moment to be exactly what it is, without pulling the mind into drama. That doesn't mean you don't care. It means your care is rooted, not scattered. It means your attention isn't yanked from place to place by every passing mood or opinion. This clarity comes from being able to feel everything, but not be overwhelmed by any of it. To hear painful words without collapsing, to experience joy without grasping, to meet discomfort without resistance. It's a balance that feels like peace, not because nothing affects you, but because nothing controls you. Non-reactivity trains the mind to stop turning every emotion into a command. Just because anger arises doesn't mean it needs to be acted on. Just because sadness is present doesn't mean it defines the entire day. Equanimity allows these experiences to be felt fully but held lightly, like watching waves move through water without trying to stop or chase them. When the mind reacts quickly, it often does so based on old patterns: fear, ego, memory. But when there's space, when reaction doesn't instantly follow stimulus, the mind begins to see differently. It sees the situation, not just the story about the situation. It sees the person, not just the projection. It sees the choice, not just the habit. Equanimity is not passive, it's alert. It's the kind of stillness that doesn't flinch. It watches everything with equal attention, equal care, and equal openness. And in that evenness, wisdom grows. Because now, perception is clean. It's not colored by defense or craving. It's not warped by anger or fear. It's calm, not because it avoids intensity, but because it can stand inside it without being burned. This doesn't mean you never speak up or take action. It means you act from clarity, not compulsion. You respond instead of react. And that small difference changes everything. Responses are shaped by presence. Reactions are shaped by fear. One clears the path, the other clouds it. Equanimity also helps with inner emotions. When guilt rises, you don't have to spiral. When doubt surfaces, you don't have to fix it. You just see it. You hold it. You breathe, and it passes. This ability to let emotions move through without pushing them away or pulling them in, that's the core of mental balance. It's what makes clear seeing possible. In relationships, equanimity brings depth. You stop needing people to behave a certain way for you to feel okay. You stop controlling, fixing, proving. You start listening. You start respecting their process. You stop taking every shift in their mood as a reflection of your worth. And that space lets love breathe. It lets conversation become less about defense and more about understanding. Even in spiritual practice, equanimity is key. Without it, progress becomes a game of highs and lows. One day you're centered, the next you're scattered, and you think you've failed. But with equanimity, you meet every state with the same attention. You don't cling to stillness or resist distraction. You just return. And that return becomes stronger than any mood. This doesn't mean you float through life unaffected. It means you stay grounded when you are affected. You allow the feeling, but you don't become it. And that makes you more human, not less. Because now your presence is not tied to performance. It's steady because it no longer fights what is. Equanimity is also the mind's immune system. It stops you from getting infected by every thought, every event, every tension around you. It allows you to move through difficulty without absorbing it. And when this becomes natural, life becomes less chaotic. Not because chaos disappears, but because your clarity is no longer dependent on peace. This inner balance can be trained through mindfulness, through watching the rise of reaction and choosing pause, through breathing through discomfort instead of fleeing it, through welcoming joy without needing to keep it. through seeing that everything comes and goes, including the need to react. When equanimity grows, the mind starts to trust itself, not because it has the answers, but because it no longer panics when it doesn't. And from that trust comes calm. From that calm comes clarity. And from that clarity comes wisdom, not the kind written in books, but the kind that's felt in the middle of uncertainty. You stop being pulled into every current. You stop confusing emotion for direction. You stop believing that intensity equals truth. You begin to meet life like the sky meets the weather, open, wide, unchanged by every storm that passes through. Even now, if there's something stirring in you, a doubt, a hope, a memory, let it rise, let it stay, let it go. You don't need to change it. You don't need to chase it. Just see it. Just feel it. Just let it be. This is equanimity. This is clarity through balance, not apathy, not detachment, just steady, open awareness. You're not turning away from life, you're finally meeting it as it is. Now that equanimity has started to take root, not as indifference, but as the calm strength to feel without being swept away, what comes next is not a new method, but a new lens. One that clarifies everything it touches. One that doesn't ask you to let go of life, but to see it more clearly. There's a principle at the heart of Buddhist wisdom that is so simple, it's often overlooked, and so powerful that once it's truly seen, it changes the way the mind relates to everything. That principle is anicca, impermanence. And when used as a mental filter, it doesn't just lighten thought. It dissolves the very weight that keeps the mind trapped in stories, reactions, and grasping. Impermanence is not a philosophical concept to be debated. It's the basic truth that everything changes. Every sound fades. Every emotion moves. Every thought arises and falls away. Every relationship evolves. Nothing that begins stays the same, and yet the mind forgets this over and over again. It treats passing things as if they're fixed. It turns temporary experiences into permanent problems. It attaches as if the object of attachment will remain forever. This is where suffering begins, not in the experience, but in the belief that it will last. The mind holds on to moments, identities, roles, moods, and people, as if doing so can freeze them in place. But nothing stays. Not even the one trying to hold on. That's not tragic. That's liberation, if it's seen clearly. To use impermanence as a mental filter means to view every moment, thought, and sensation as already gone. Not in a dark or detached way, but in a deeply present one. Because when something is seen as temporary, the mind softens. It stops trying to control, to cling, to fix. It begins to allow, and in that allowing, clarity returns. Pain, for example, when seen through the lens of permanence, feels unbearable. This will never end, but when seen through impermanence, it becomes manageable. This is passing, even now. The sensation might still be strong, but the fear around it loosens, and that loosening is often what allows healing to begin. Joy, too, becomes clearer through this lens. When it's not clung to, it becomes purer. There's less fear of losing it because it's already known to be passing. That doesn't make it less beautiful. It makes it more vibrant, because now it's being fully experienced, not hoarded. Thoughts are constantly arising and dissolving, but the mind latches onto them, builds stories around them, invests in them as if they are lasting truths. What if this goes wrong? They probably meant this when they said that. I'll always be like this. These are not permanent realities. They are momentary formations. Seen through impermanence, they lose their stickiness. The thought arises. You see it. You don't follow it. And it fades. Even the sense of self is not stable. One moment you feel confident, the next uncertain. One day you identify with calm, the next with anger. But none of these are you. They are states moving through you. Holding on to any one of them is like trying to catch sunlight with your hands. It's not the moment's job to last. It's the mind's job to see that it doesn't have to. Relationships, careers, physical strength, memory, even your deepest beliefs. Everything is shifting. But seeing this doesn't make life fragile. It makes it real. The truth is, things don't last because they're broken. They pass because that's their nature. And when this is no longer resisted, there is a quiet kind of strength that rises, a readiness to face anything, not because you've hardened, but because you've stopped expecting what is meant to change to stay the same. Using impermanence as a filter doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb. It means refining emotion. Feeling without gripping, loving without fearing loss, acting without needing a guarantee. You start to move with life, not against it. Even the moments of silence in your day, the stillness between tasks, the breath between thoughts, those are constantly changing too. And when the mind stops needing them to be more than they are, they become enough. Presence deepens. Peace becomes less of a prize and more of a path. Letting go becomes easier when the mind no longer sees what it's holding as lasting. You don't have to hate what you're releasing. You just have to see that holding tighter won't keep it from changing. This applies to old memories, unhelpful habits, outdated goals. They served a version of you that no longer exists, and the mind that learns to bow to change stops suffering from it. There's also humility in impermanence. It reminds you that nothing you build, no reputation, no role, no possession, will outlast change. But this humility is freeing. It simplifies. It clears away the mental clutter of needing to be important, of needing everything to be remembered or preserved. This clarity is not cold. It's kind. It says, feel this fully now, because it won't stay. And that becomes a kind of wisdom that softens pride, jealousy, and fear. Because all of those emotions are rooted in illusion of fixed self, of fixed outcome, of fixed worth. But when impermanence is understood, those illusions begin to melt, and what's left is tenderness, presence, grace. Gratitude also deepens through impermanence, not the kind that's forced, but the kind that arises when you know something won't last. The touch of a hand, the breath in your chest, the sound of the rain. When these are seen as fleeting, they're no longer taken for granted. They become sacred, not because they're perfect, but because they're temporary. Even struggle becomes more bearable through this lens, because when you know that what you're going through will pass, you stop fearing that it defines you. You stop turning discomfort into identity. You allow the storm, not because you want it, but because you know it won't stay. This is what makes impermanence such a powerful filter. It strips away what doesn't matter. It shows you what's real by reminding you it's passing. And in that reminder, there's a deep release, not from life, but from illusion. As you rest now, let this truth settle into your awareness. Nothing you are feeling right now will stay. The peace, the discomfort, the thought that wants to linger, it's all moving. Let it move, let it change, let it end. And don't chase what leaves. Just stay here, with the flow, with the breath, with the truth that everything is already on its way out, and that this too is okay. You're not losing what you love. You're learning how to hold it without needing it to stay. Now that impermanence has been seen not as a threat, but as a filter, not as something to mourn, but as something that clarifies, the mind begins to open in a different way. Less cluttered by resistance, less tangled in control, more willing to be with things as they are. But even as this clarity deepens, life continues. The world doesn't slow down, the noise doesn't vanish. And that's where a deeper kind of strength is needed. One that doesn't depend on silence to stay centered. One that can stand inside the storm without becoming part of it. What comes next is not about escaping chaos. It's about remaining still while everything moves around you. Clarity doesn't come from perfect conditions. It comes from cultivating steadiness within changing ones. The idea that peace only exists in quiet rooms with candles and cushions is a misunderstanding. True inner balance is measured in motion. It's the ability to stay grounded even when everything else feels uncertain. And this is where the practice of becoming the still eye in the storm begins. In a hurricane, there is always a center, a calm point where the wind doesn't reach. The storm may rage around it, but the center stays silent. That is the role awareness plays in the middle of life's chaos. It doesn't stop the noise, it simply refuses to spin with it. The practice, then, is to learn how to return to that center again and again, no matter what pulls at your attention. This isn't about suppressing reactions or pretending not to feel. It's about building the capacity to notice the pull without getting yanked. You can be in a loud place, a stressful job, a tense conversation, and still feel something inside that doesn't move. That center is not far away. It's underneath the reactions, beneath the thinking, beneath the emotional waves. And every time you pause and return to it, it grows stronger. The first step is recognizing what pulls you away from center. For some, it's urgency, the need to fix, solve, react immediately. For others, it's overstimulation, too much sound, too many opinions, too much pressure. And for many, it's internal noise, worry, doubt, self-judgment. But no matter the source, the principle is the same. Clarity returns when awareness stops chasing every signal and begins to anchor. Breath is often the first anchor, not because it's magical, but because it's always here. No matter what's happening externally, the breath is a doorway inward. But the goal isn't to use breath to escape. It's to use it to stabilize. One slow inhale, one soft exhale, and already the storm feels further away, not gone, just no longer inside you. The body, too, can be an anchor. When the mind races, bring attention to the weight of your feet on the floor, the warmth of your hands, the shape of your spine. These aren't distractions, they are reminders. Reminders that while thoughts spin and the world shouts, there is a place within you that isn't moving. And every time you return there, the storm becomes just weather. Awareness itself is also a center. Not the content of your thoughts, but the awareness that notices them. That space is never stirred. It's never in conflict. It never panics. When you drop beneath the storyline and rest in the watcher, everything shifts. You realize the noise is happening, but you are not the noise. You are not the storm. You are the sky it moves through. In practice, this means training yourself to pause, not just physically, but mentally. To notice the moment when reactivity wants to take over. To see the urge to reply fast, to defend, to judge, to fix. And instead of following it, you pause, you breathe, you return. That pause is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's the moment that makes everything else clearer. Even in environments that feel chaotic, offices, homes, crowded streets, this inner center can remain accessible. You don't need silence to find it. You need willingness. Willingness to come back, to not lose yourself in the moment's pressure, to stay seated within yourself, even when the world demands that you stand and fight. And when the storm is emotional, when grief or anger or fear are rising hard and fast, the same practice applies. Feel it, name it, but stay with what sees it. Stay with what doesn't need to collapse under it. That's not avoidance, that's power. Because only from that place can you truly respond, not react. There's also a physicality to staying centered. It helps to slow your gestures, to move intentionally, to walk slower, speak slower, eat slower. These small shifts train the nervous system to stop rushing, and that rewiring sends a message to the brain. There is space here. You're not being hunted. You can breathe. This doesn't mean becoming passive or distant. It means becoming precise, knowing when to act and when to rest, when to speak and when to stay quiet. It means your energy is no longer being spent on reacting to every wave. Instead, it's focused on staying balanced, so that when action does come, it's sharp, clean, and aligned. And when mistakes happen, and they will, the practice doesn't fall apart. You don't need to stay centered perfectly. You only need to return. Each return builds resilience. Each time you catch yourself getting pulled into the storm and come back, you build the habit of steadiness. Over time, that habit becomes your new baseline. Not as a performance, as a posture, a natural way of being. This way of meeting chaos doesn't just protect your peace, it enhances your clarity, because you begin to see what others miss. You begin to hear what's really being said, not just the surface noise. You begin to act from a deeper place, and others feel it. Your presence becomes a kind of medicine, not because you've withdrawn, but because you've stopped echoing the panic. The world will continue to spin. People will continue to change. Emotions will continue to rise and fall. But your practice now is different. You're not trying to control the wind. You're building the ability to remain steady while it blows. That's the still I. That's the unshaken center, and it's not far away. It's right here, in the space between one breath and the next. You don't need the world to calm down. You only need to stop joining its storm. They told you that a clear mind comes from fixing every problem, from having more time, from escaping stress. But if that were true, why does the mind still race at night? Why, even in silence, does it feel so loud inside your head? Why does peace feel so far away, even when everything looks fine on the outside? The truth is, mental clarity doesn't come from controlling the world around you. It comes from understanding the world within you. And Buddhism holds the map. For over 2,500 years, monks, sages, and seekers have used its lessons to quiet the noise, see through illusion, and find stillness in the middle of chaos. Not by escaping life, but by becoming deeply present in it. They didn't fight for peace. They uncovered it. And tonight, so will you. As you listen, something inside will shift. Thoughts that used to cling will begin to pass. Emotions that once overwhelmed will start to soften. And in the space between one breath and the next, you'll begin to feel it. Clarity. Not the kind that comes from having all the answers, but the kind that comes when the need for answers disappears. This isn't just background noise to help you sleep. This is a gentle return to yourself. A quiet remembering. A release. So close your eyes, let go of the day, and get ready to fall asleep to the best Buddhism lessons for mental clarity. The fog is lifting. Let's begin. And now that the fog is lifting and you've begun to settle into this soft space within, it's time to step into the first lesson, not with force, not with effort, but with a quiet, honest look inward. Because the clarity you've been looking for, it's not something you need to win. It's something you've simply been covering up, layer by layer, with noise, control, and resistance. And tonight, that ends. Tonight, we uncover what was always there beneath the noise. There's a strength no one teaches in school. It's not loud. It's not aggressive. It doesn't shout or shove. It doesn't push its way forward or try to dominate a room. This strength walks softly, listens deeply, and carries peace with it like a lantern. That's the strength Buddhism speaks of, the strength of the gentle warrior. This warrior doesn't fight against thoughts, doesn't battle emotions, doesn't go to war with life. Instead, this warrior watches, observes, sits with what is, not to control it, but to understand it. And that understanding is where clarity is born. The world teaches people to tighten up when things go wrong. Tense the shoulders, clench the fists, think harder, fix it, force it, figure it out. But no one ever tells you that clarity doesn't arrive through tension. It arrives through space. It doesn't come when you're dominating the moment. It comes when you're present with it. Not trying to outsmart the storm, but becoming still enough to see through it. In Buddhism, the way to clarity isn't about turning the mind into a machine. It's about becoming the silent witness behind the mind. It's about stepping back from the swirl of thoughts, the rush of emotion, the hunger for answers, and realizing that none of it defines you. You are not the storm. You are the sky it moves through. Every time a thought rises, the mind usually reacts. It grabs onto it, chases it, feeds it. A single thought can trigger a chain reaction, one that turns a small worry into a sleepless night. But what if you didn't follow it? What if, instead of responding, you just noticed? That's the art of the gentle warrior, not reacting blindly, but recognizing fully, not suppressing, not indulging, just seeing. And it starts with one simple shift. Stop trying to control everything you think. Just observe it. When the thought says, "You're not doing enough," don't fight it. Don't believe it either. Just watch it pass like a leaf floating on water. When the feeling of anxiety rises in your chest, don't try to push it down or explain it away. Feel it fully. Let it move through. It won't stay unless you resist it. Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah once said, "Try to let go, not with your head, but with your heart." That's what the gentle warrior does. He lets go from a place of wisdom, not avoidance. He doesn't run away from discomfort. He meets it, understands it, and allows it to pass without turning it into a personal failure. And with that stillness, the fog begins to clear. This path doesn't need perfection. You don't need to be some ideal version of yourself to begin. You just need to stop fighting your experience. Even now, whatever you're feeling, welcome it, allow it, be with it. Because mental clarity isn't a clean slate. It's a deep and honest acceptance of whatever is already here without needing it to be something else. And that's where the paradox lies. The more you try to force clarity, the murkier things get, like stirring water to make it clear. But the moment you stop stirring, stop trying to control your experience, that's when the mud settles. That's when the water clears on its own. Non-resistance isn't weakness. It's the strongest choice you can make when your mind is spinning. To step out of the spiral and simply watch it go. That's when you become the space rather than the content. That's when you realize you don't need to fix every thought, solve every emotion, or control every outcome to feel okay. You just need to return to stillness. Buddhist meditation isn't about sitting with a blank mind. It's about sitting with whatever comes up and watching it pass. It's training yourself to stop being pulled by every movement inside you. And when you do that, when you stop feeding the chaos, clarity doesn't just visit, it lives in you. There's a moment that happens, and it's small, but powerful. It's the moment you notice you're thinking without getting lost in the thought. That flicker of awareness is everything. That's what the gentle warrior practices. Not control over the mind, but connection with it. That little space between awareness and reaction is where freedom lives. Think of all the times you tried to think your way to peace. Analyze, overanalyze, seek advice, Google answers, journal endlessly, meditate harder, and still the noise remained. But then think of that one moment, maybe just a second, where you took a deep breath, let go, and simply existed. That moment, right there, is what Buddhism calls presence. And presence doesn't need your effort, it needs your surrender. This surrender is not giving up, it's giving in to what's real, giving in to the moment. And it's here that the mind stops spinning because it no longer has to fight. The clarity comes not because you grabbed it, but because you stopped pushing it away. So much of what clutters the mind is resistance. Resistance to pain, resistance to not knowing, resistance to being imperfect. But when that resistance softens, so does the noise. You begin to see things not as your mind tells you they are, but as they truly are. That's the clarity Buddhists speak of, not a perfect mind, but a peaceful one, not a mind without problems, but a mind that doesn't turn every problem into an identity. Right now, you don't need to change your past. You don't need to know what tomorrow holds. You just need to sit with what is here and soften your grip. That's what the gentle warrior does. He softens, he breathes, he watches, and through that, he becomes stronger than any storm. There's nothing to fix tonight. No part of you needs to be improved before you're allowed to feel peace. Mental clarity begins when you stop measuring your worth by your productivity or how well you've figured it out. Clarity begins when you realize there's nothing missing, not in you, not in this moment. There is a stillness at the core of every person, a silent center that doesn't need to be earned. Most people just forget how to access it because they've been taught to seek answers outside themselves. But the gentle warrior remembers. He closes his eyes. He listens inward. He follows the breath, not to escape, but to arrive. And there, in the soft rhythm of inhale and exhale, he finds it. Stillness. And in that stillness, clarity. Even if your thoughts are still swirling, even if the day felt heavy, even if your heart is unsure, This stillness is already inside you. You don't have to feel it perfectly. You don't have to meditate like a monk. You just have to pause right here, right now, and let the moment be enough. Because peace doesn't scream, it whispers. And the gentle warrior learns to hear it, not by fighting through the noise, but by resting beneath it. And so now, with your body resting and your breath softening, let the lesson settle. Let the mind rest in stillness, even if just for a few seconds at a time. That's all it takes for clarity to begin, not by pushing thoughts away, but by no longer grabbing them. Let it be easy, let it be quiet, let it be simple. The first step to clarity is this: don't force it. You're already on your way. And now that you've softened into stillness, now that the fight has been set down, and you've begun to feel the weight of your mind growing lighter, not from fixing, but from observing, it's time to take another step deeper. Stillness was the opening, the gentle door into awareness. But now we begin the practice of seeing with clean eyes, eyes that don't name, eyes that don't rush to define, eyes that simply see. There is a layer of perception that most people never touch, not because it's hidden, but because it's too simple for the mind to trust. The moment something is seen, the brain labels it: tree, man, sadness, noise, threat, comfort. Meaning is slapped on everything like price tags in a store, and before there's even a breath, the world is already categorized. But Buddhism teaches something radical: pure seeing. Not as concept, not as story, but as presence. This lesson isn't about turning off your thoughts. It's about seeing what's here before the thoughts attach themselves. That space, right before judgment kicks in, that's where clarity lives. That moment, right before I like this or I don't like this, that's perception in its purest form. And when you learn to stay there, even for a few seconds, the noise of life quiets in a way that no external silence could ever create. Pure perception doesn't ask the mind to disappear. It asks it to step back. It doesn't reject thoughts. It simply doesn't follow them. When a person walks by, most minds say, "That shirt is ugly," or "They must be rich," or "Why did they look at me that way?" But beneath all of that is what actually happened. A person walked by. That's all. That's reality. Everything else was interpretation, and interpretation is where suffering begins. Seeing without labeling is not about becoming a blank slate. It's about not adding anything extra. It's noticing a flower without calling it beautiful or ordinary. It's hearing a laugh without deciding whether it's annoying or joyful. It's meeting a moment and letting it be exactly what it is, without needing to change it or define it or fit it into some mental box. There's a calmness that arises when this becomes practice. When you stop sticking names on everything, the world starts to feel softer. The edges smooth out. People become less threatening. Emotions become less dramatic. And you begin to understand something life-changing. Most of your stress was coming not from life, but from how you labeled life. Right now, as you listen, there are sounds around you. Maybe the hum of the room, a distant car, the rhythm of your breath. Notice how quickly the mind wants to judge them: quiet, loud, distracting, soothing. But what if those labels dropped? What if the sound was just sound? No meaning, no backstory, just presence. This is what Buddhist teachers mean when they say, "See the world as it is, not as you are." Because most people don't see reality. They see their reactions to reality. They see their fears projected, their memories superimposed, their hopes stretched over the present moment like a film. And then they wonder why life feels heavy, why people seem complicated, why peace is so hard to hold. The weight is in the story. The clarity is in the seeing. Seeing without labeling is also a practice of trust. Trusting that things don't need to be defined in order to be real. Trusting that you don't need to understand something in order to let it be. And most of all, trusting that the mind doesn't need to run commentary to feel safe. In fact, the commentary is often what keeps the mind afraid. Judgment is a reflex, a protection mechanism, but it becomes a trap. The more things are judged, the more life shrinks. People become enemies or allies. Moments become good or bad, and clarity disappears under the weight of constant evaluation. But when that need to evaluate drops, the mind becomes spacious, like walking into a wide field after being trapped in a narrow hallway. Children sometimes have this kind of perception. Before they learn all the names and rules, they see everything as new. They don't look at a cloud and think, "That's a cumulonimbus." They just look. And in that looking, there is joy, there is clarity, not because of what the cloud is, but because there's nothing being added to what it is. The goal isn't to become childlike, it's to unlearn what's been layered on top of perception, to let the mind be sharp but not sharp-edged, to allow perception to become soft again, flexible, free. And it's not just about external things. Seeing without labeling also applies to your own thoughts. So often, people identify with what arises in their heads. I had a jealous thought, so I must be a jealous person. But that's not seeing, that's labeling. Pure seeing would notice the thought and not add identity. A thought arose. That's it. Not me, not mine, just passing weather in the mind. This is where healing begins. When the judgment is dropped, shame dissolves. You realize you've never been the voice in your head. You've only been the space it speaks in. And in that space, there's room to breathe, room to rest, room to just be. And yes, the mind will still try to label. That's okay. It's been trained to do that. The practice isn't to eliminate the tendency, it's to catch it, to see the labeling as it happens and then choose not to follow it. Every time you do, you strengthen the awareness muscle, and that awareness is what leads to clarity. Even emotions can be seen this way. Sadness doesn't need to be named as bad. Anger doesn't need to be categorized as unspiritual. They are sensations, movements, weather patterns. They don't need moral value, they need presence. And presence comes through seeing, not through judging. So next time you feel overwhelmed, ask yourself this: what am I adding? What story is being built on top of the experience? What label is turning this moment into something it doesn't have to be? Strip it back. Let it be simple. This doesn't mean you walk through life cold or detached. Quite the opposite. When the labels drop, the heart opens. You're no longer judging people, you're seeing them. You're no longer trying to control every situation, you're showing up for it. You're no longer lost in what something means, you're awake to what it is. That's what makes this practice sacred. It connects you to reality in the most honest way. No masks, no filters, just raw, beautiful truth. And in that space, life becomes vivid again. Colors seem richer, sounds feel fuller. Even silence carries weight. This is not detachment. This is depth. You begin to realize that nothing needs to be named to be meaningful. In fact, it's often the things that can't be named that matter the most. A look, a touch, a feeling in the chest when something clicks into place. No label, just presence. The more this becomes practice, the more your reactions shift. You stop getting pulled into drama, stop clinging to praise, stop fearing rejection, because without labels, those things lose power. What once felt like personal attacks now feel like passing breezes. What once felt like validation now feels like a moment, nothing more. And that is freedom. To see without labeling is to reclaim your attention, to stop handing your peace to every thought that shows up with a loud voice, and to start choosing deliberately, gently, what you give energy to. It's not easy, but it is simple, and the more you do it, the lighter the mind becomes, not from numbing, not from escaping, but from meeting life exactly as it is. No story, no judgment, just clear, open seeing. So now, let the practice begin. Let tonight be a slow return to vision that's been there all along, not the mind's interpretation of the world, but the world itself, unveiled. Let every breath take you deeper into presence. Let every sound be just a sound. Let every thought be just a cloud. No grabbing, no chasing, no naming, just this. And in this, clarity. The kind that doesn't come from knowing more, but from seeing less. Now that the habit of labeling has been gently loosened, now that you've tasted what it feels like to simply see without needing to define, there's a new kind of space beginning to open up. A clarity that doesn't depend on controlling the mind or naming the moment. But that space isn't just the absence of noise. It's something deeper, something quieter. What comes next isn't just about watching thoughts. It's about resting in what's beneath them. And what lives there may be the most powerful stillness you've never noticed. There's something most people miss, not because it's hidden, but because it's quiet. It's not the thoughts, it's not even the emotions, it's the space between them. That small gap where nothing is being said, no inner voice, no mental commentary, just presence. That gap is the doorway. And once attention learns to rest there, even for a moment, something shifts. Awareness sharpens, tension dissolves. The mind doesn't just feel quieter, it feels clean. This silence isn't the silence of an empty room. It's the silence that lives under every word, between each thought, inside each pause. It's not something you create. It's something you uncover, because it's always there, between the inhale and the exhale, between one idea and the next. It's just usually ignored, not out of malice, but out of habit. The mind is addicted to content. It chases noise, seeks stimulation, builds narratives. But when all of that falls away, what's left is awareness itself. Lucid, alive, untouched by the stories that float on top of it. When someone first notices this space, it can feel disorienting, like standing in a quiet field after years of city noise. There's an instinct to fill it, to bring something back into it, thoughts, questions, distractions. But with practice, that need fades. The silence stops feeling like emptiness and starts feeling like nourishment, a space that isn't lacking anything but is instead full of clarity. Buddhist meditation often emphasizes the breath not just to calm the body, but to train attention to notice this space. The breath is a rhythm, and between each inhale and each exhale there's a moment, brief but real, where the mind can rest. That pause is like a doorway into stillness. And if you rest your awareness there long enough, something extraordinary happens. You realize the thoughts never really owned you. You were just visiting them. The silence between thoughts is not a goal. It's not a place you arrive at after solving all your problems. It's available now, even in the middle of chaos, especially in the middle of chaos. Because that silence doesn't care what the thoughts are saying. It's unaffected by their content. And the moment you begin to dwell in it, the weight of thought begins to dissolve. This space isn't a blank. It's alive. It's not numb. It's deeply alert. It's the clearest kind of seeing, because there's nothing distorting it. When the mind stops talking, awareness wakes up. And in that wakefulness, a different kind of intelligence appears. Not the kind that calculates, the kind that knows, without needing to explain. So how do you stay in this space? You don't force it. You notice it. You rest attention on it, like you'd rest your hand on calm water. Gently, respectfully. You breathe into it. You allow the next thought to come, but you don't hold it. You let it rise. You let it fall, and you stay with what's left after it goes. In daily life, thoughts come quickly, but the space is always there, in the pause before answering a question, in the moment between seeing and reacting, in the stillness that surrounds a sound. The more attention practices dwelling there, the more stable that clarity becomes. It stops being a fleeting moment. It becomes a place the mind returns to more easily, a kind of home inside awareness. This is what the masters mean when they speak of pure mind or Buddha mind. Not a mind without thought, but a mind that is no longer enslaved by thought. A mind that can hold silence without fear. A mind that is not hungry for distraction because it has discovered something far more fulfilling. Peace without effort. The silence between thoughts is also the birthplace of intuition. When the mental noise clears, what's left is a deeper kind of guidance, one that doesn't speak in words, but in clarity. You begin to feel what's right without needing to debate it. You sense what matters without weighing every pro and con. Because truth, when the mind is silent, becomes obvious. But that truth isn't loud. It doesn't compete. That's why it's often missed. People look for wisdom in the loudest thought, the most urgent emotion, the most compelling story. But real wisdom speaks in stillness. It arises in the space between. And when you begin to value that space more than the noise loses its grip. And yet, thoughts will still come. That's okay. The silence doesn't fight them. It welcomes them and lets them pass, like clouds moving through an open sky. The goal is not to become empty, but to stop mistaking every passing thought for the sky itself. Even now, as you rest, there is space between these words. And in that space, awareness can expand. Not because of what is said, but because of what is not said. The mind doesn't need more content to become clear. It needs less clutter, less effort, less noise. This is what makes the silence between thoughts so powerful. It isn't passive. It's the most active awareness you can experience. It watches without interfering. It hears without translating. It knows without judging. It allows everything and is disturbed by nothing. This awareness has no agenda. It doesn't demand productivity. It doesn't chase happiness. It doesn't fear sadness. It simply sees. And in that seeing, everything settles. Not because life got easier, but because you stopped trying to fight what already is. This kind of stillness doesn't remove responsibility. It deepens it. You become more present, more attuned, more grounded. But you stop reacting from habit and start responding from presence. Decisions become simpler, emotions become clearer. Life becomes lighter, not because it changed, but because your relationship to it did. In a world that never stops talking, silence becomes sacred. And when you learn to listen to that silence, you begin to hear life more clearly. Not the drama, not the mental spin, but the gentle pulse of truth that never needed to shout to be heard. Rest there now, in that quiet space. Feel how awareness softens, how clarity rises. Not like a wave crashing in, but like mist lifting from the ground. Slow, gentle, real. This is not about achieving some mystical state. It's about returning to what's already here. The mind will tell you it's not enough, that you need to do more, know more, think more. But in this space, those voices fade. And what's left is pure, clear, whole. And if you ever get lost in the noise again, and you will, remember this: the silence never left. It's still here, waiting for you to notice, not outside, but beneath. Beneath the thinking, beneath the labeling, beneath the effort, always beneath. You're not learning how to create peace. You're learning how to notice where it's always been. And now that you've touched the silence beneath thought, now that you've rested in that deep, wordless awareness, where clarity rises not from thinking harder, but from simply being, there's something else we need to clear up. Not inside the mind, but around it. One of the most misused, misunderstood ideas to ever come out of Buddhist philosophy. A concept so often twisted that it has created more confusion than clarity. And yet, when understood properly, it becomes one of the cleanest, most empowering truths you can live by. It's time to talk about karma, not the version sold in memes, but the real thing. Karma isn't punishment. It's not the universe keeping receipts. It's not a cosmic scoreboard waiting to catch people in their worst moment. It's not about revenge, and it's not about reward. Karma, in its original form, is about clarity. It's about cause and effect, not in the distant future, but in the present moment, right here, right now. Every thought, every word, every choice sends out ripples, and those ripples return, not as judgment, as consequence. The misunderstanding starts when karma is turned into superstition. Someone cuts in line, and the first thought is, "Don't worry, karma will get them." That belief feels satisfying, but it misses the point. Karma isn't about someone else's path. It's about yours. It's not a tool for control. It's a mirror, a direct reflection of how your own actions shape your own experience, not just someday, but instantly. When anger is chosen, karma isn't waiting for a future punishment. The punishment is the anger, the inner tightness, the way it clouds perception, the way it distorts the world. The moment that energy is picked up, the consequence is already happening. That's karma, not a spiritual police officer, but a natural unfolding. When kindness is chosen, the result isn't a gold star in the sky. The result is the immediate softening of the heart, the lightness that spreads through the body, the clarity that rises when the mind isn't tangled in harm. That's karma, not a reward, but a reflection. This understanding strips away the fantasy and brings you back to reality. It shows how everything you feel is linked to everything you do, not because of cosmic judgment, but because action is creation. Thought creates feeling. Intention shapes perception. Speech sculpts the way the world responds. It's all connected. And when that's seen clearly, responsibility no longer feels like a burden. It feels like power. Karma, when misunderstood, becomes a way to blame people for their suffering. They must have done something to deserve this. But this, too, is a distortion. Buddhist teachings don't say that all pain is earned. They say that much of what we suffer comes from how we relate to what happens, not just what happens. And in that gap, there is freedom. Even in moments that aren't your fault, karma lives in your response. It lives in the choice to tighten or release, to resist or accept, to react from fear or respond with clarity. That's the power no one can take away, not even in hardship. And that's where real peace begins, when the weight of needing life to be fair drops and the focus returns to how you meet it. There's no scoreboard keeping tally. There is only presence. And from that presence, there is choice. Karma is not a sentence. It's a path, a feedback loop. The more aware you are, the cleaner your choices. The cleaner your choices, the lighter your mind. And that's where the clarity lives, not in knowing what's next, but in knowing you're showing up for it with integrity. Pop culture has turned karma into something external, as if it's watching from a distance. But real karma is intimate. It's not something that happens to you, it's something that happens through you. Every action sets the tone for the next moment. That's it. No scoreboard, just momentum. When this is seen, shame begins to dissolve. Because karma isn't a tool for guilt. It's a wake-up call. It says, pay attention. Notice what your actions create. And if you don't like the result, choose differently. No need to spiral, just presence, just learning, just clarity through trial and refinement. This understanding also quiets the need to judge others. If karma is no longer a tool to condemn people, you stop wasting energy hoping they get what's coming. Instead, that attention turns inward. What ripples are you sending out? What energy are you living in? What loops are you stuck in? And how can you begin to soften them? Karma is also not fate. It doesn't say, this is who you are and you're stuck with it. It says, this is what you've done and you can always shift. That's why karma and mindfulness go hand in hand. Without mindfulness, karma unfolds unconsciously. Old habits repeat, reactions drive decisions, and life feels like a pattern you can't escape. But the moment awareness enters, the loop begins to weaken. You catch the moment before the outburst. You feel the urge but don't follow it. You pause, you breathe, and right there, the pattern is broken. That's karma too, not as debt, but as a turning point. Every pause is a pivot. Every moment of awareness interrupts the old trajectory and makes space for a new one. And the clarity that comes with this isn't loud. It doesn't say, you've fixed your life. It says, you're no longer sleepwalking through it. That's a different kind of peace. Not the peace of perfection, but the peace of alignment, of knowing you're no longer creating harm, of knowing your choices match your values. And from that alignment, clarity blooms. In Buddhism, karma is also deeply tied to speech. What is said becomes the seed of perception. Words build reality, not just for others, but for the speaker. Every complaint, every insult, every exaggeration plants a distortion, and those distortions create confusion. But when speech becomes clean, when it comes from truth and compassion, the mind clears too. Not because it's trying to be holy, but because it's no longer tangled in noise. The same goes for thought. Thoughts matter, not because they're magical, but because they shape attention. A thought repeated becomes a belief. A belief becomes a lens, and that lens determines how the world is seen. When those thoughts are born from fear, the lens fogs. When they're born from presence, the lens clears. Karma is the shape your attention takes, and that shape defines how you experience the moment. This isn't theory, it's lived. Right now, whatever state your mind is in, trace it back. What were the thoughts, the actions, the attitudes that led here? Not to blame, just to see. The clearer you see the trail, the more power you have in choosing the next step. And if things feel heavy, karma offers this kindness. You can stop the cycle anytime. You don't need to fix the past to move forward. You just need to become aware in the present. The mind wants to complicate this. It wants to ask, what do I need to heal before I can feel free? But karma answers, you're already in the next moment. Use it. Every gentle breath, every small kindness, every time you choose truth over convenience, compassion over pride, clarity over reactivity, you shift the field. Slowly, yes, but powerfully. And you'll feel it. The internal tightness starts to fade. The reactions lose their bite. And the clarity you once begged for begins to rise without effort. This is not spiritual fantasy. It's practical awakening. It's karma as the most grounded kind of wisdom. Not magic, just cause and effect. See clearly, act cleanly. And peace comes not as a prize, but as a byproduct. Right now, you are not being judged. You're being shaped. Every breath you take is forming the next breath. Every thought you let pass without grabbing is dissolving the fog. Every soft word, every silent moment, every time you choose presence over habit, you are creating clarity in real time. That's karma. Let that truth settle. Let it cut through the noise. You're not waiting for the universe to deliver justice. You're not trying to escape from invisible punishments. You're choosing, breath by breath, to show up differently. And that difference changes everything. That's what the ancient teachers knew. Karma is not fear. Karma is freedom. Not control, but clarity. You're not being followed. You're being reflected. And now that karma has been unwrapped, not as fate or punishment, but as moment-by-moment clarity, you begin to see your power more clearly. Every response, every choice, every breath you take sends ripples forward. And within that unfolding, there's a question. What happens when pain arises? Because it will. Even when you're mindful, even when you're present, life will still touch you. But how you respond in those moments decides everything. And that's where the next lesson begins, by revealing a habit most people don't even realize they have. Pain itself is not always the problem. Sometimes the problem is what follows, the silent reaction that sneaks in after the wound. Buddhism calls this the second arrow. The first arrow is the pain that life brings, loss, rejection, failure, disappointment. These things are inevitable. But the second arrow is the one the mind fires at itself, the guilt, the judgment, the spiraling thoughts, the story that says, this shouldn't be happening, or I'm weak for feeling this way. And it's that second arrow that often does more damage than the first. Most people live unaware of this second arrow. They believe their suffering is solely because of the original pain. But that pain, as sharp as it may be, is usually temporary. It's the added layers of mental resistance that make it heavy, the habit of replaying it, questioning it, fighting it. That's where the weight builds. That's what muddies clarity. The practice here is to see pain without creating extra pain, to feel discomfort without turning it into identity, to allow sadness without labeling it as failure. When this becomes a practice, something incredible happens. Suffering starts to shrink. Not because the world becomes easier, but because the mind stops compounding the difficulty. This lesson asks for one thing: honesty. It asks you to notice when you're hurting and ask yourself gently, what am I adding to this? It's a question that cuts through noise. It doesn't judge the pain, it clears the fog around it. It reveals whether the suffering you feel is coming from the event itself or from the thoughts surrounding it. For example, grief may be the first arrow, but the story that says, "I should be over this by now," is the second. Shame may be the first arrow, but the voice that whispers, "No one else feels this broken," is the second. Life throws things, but it's the inner reaction, the extra arrow, that digs the wound deeper and keeps it open longer. This isn't about suppressing emotion, it's about untangling it from the judgments that bind it. When anger rises, it doesn't need to be labeled as bad. Let it be anger, let it move through. But the moment the mind adds, "I shouldn't feel this," or "I'm a bad person for reacting this way," you've entered the territory of the second arrow. And once that's seen, it can be dropped. It takes presence to notice this arrow because it arrives quickly, sometimes within seconds, but once you know to look for it, you'll see it everywhere. In disappointment that turns to self-blame, in fear that turns to shame, in sadness that turns to hopelessness. The second arrow disguises itself as truth, but it's not. It's habit, and habits can be rewired. Awareness becomes your protection, not to avoid pain, but to meet it cleanly, to feel without folding, to hurt without hardening. This is a different kind of strength, a strength that doesn't resist the wound, but refuses to deepen it. And there's freedom in that, real freedom, because you realize you don't need life to go perfectly to feel peace. You just need to stop doubling your pain. And that's entirely within your power. Whether it's physical discomfort or emotional heartbreak, the second arrow doesn't need to be fired. You can pause. You can breathe. You can see the pain for what it is: temporary, real, manageable, and most of all, not personal. Pain is part of life. It connects you to your humanity. But suffering, the kind that stays, that haunts, that clouds the mind, that often comes from the stories layered on top of pain. Stories that say, "This shouldn't happen to me. This is proof something is wrong with me. I'll never recover." These stories are not truth. They are second arrows, and the moment they are seen for what they are, they lose their power. You don't need to fight the first arrow. Let it land. Let it be felt. It might sting. It might shake you, but it will pass. All pain passes. What keeps it stuck is the resistance, the grip, the belief that it defines you. And that's what clarity restores, a gap between experience and interpretation. You can feel pain and not build an identity around it. You can cry and still know you're strong. You can be confused and still be centered, because you're no longer adding to what's already difficult. This doesn't mean you become indifferent. It means you become spacious. Spacious enough to let pain move through without trapping it. Spacious enough to feel fully and still see clearly. Spacious enough to drop the second arrow before it hits. This lesson also teaches compassion. Because once you see how often you hurt yourself without realizing it, you begin to understand others differently. You see their anger as pain upon pain. You hear their harsh words as second arrows they don't even know they're firing, and instead of reacting, you soften. Not to let harm go unchecked, but to stop the cycle of multiplying pain. There's another reason the second arrow matters. It distorts perception. When you're tangled in mental resistance, everything looks worse. The mind narrows, judgment increases, solutions disappear. But when the second arrow drops, the fog lifts. You can breathe again, think clearly, act wisely, not out of panic, but from presence. Buddhism isn't offering a life without pain. It's offering a life where pain isn't weaponized against yourself. It's offering clarity that comes from feeling instead of fixing, from witnessing instead of wrestling. And the more you practice, the faster you recognize the second arrow. You'll hear the thought, "This always happens to me." And instead of believing it, you'll pause. You'll ask, "Is that true?" You'll hear the voice say, "You're not strong enough." And instead of shrinking, you'll breathe deeper. These moments change everything, because clarity lives where story ends. You are not the second arrow. You are the space that sees it. And in that seeing, you get to choose. Not whether pain comes, but whether it stays longer than it needs to, whether it becomes identity or just another passing cloud. So now, stay here, in this quiet space of awareness. Let the first arrow be what it is. Let it come. Let it go. And in the space it leaves behind, let peace grow. Not because life got easier, but because you stopped making it harder. You've seen the trap, and now you're walking free. Now that the second arrow has been dropped, now that you've seen how most suffering isn't born from pain itself, but from what the mind does with that pain, there's a different kind of clarity beginning to take root. One that doesn't just soften the inside, but starts shaping what leaves the mouth. Because once the internal chaos settles, the next ripple is what gets spoken. And here's the truth most people miss. What's said doesn't just affect others. It builds the architecture of the mind itself. Speech doesn't just communicate thoughts, it carves them, and that's where the next lesson lives. There's a kind of mental hygiene that doesn't start with meditation or silence. It starts with the tongue, with speech, with what's spoken aloud, whispered under breath, or repeated silently in the mind. Because every word said becomes a mirror to the mind's clarity or its confusion. Right speech is one of the pillars of Buddhist practice, and it's often misunderstood. It's not about being polite or soft-spoken. It's not about censoring discomfort or sugarcoating truth. Right speech means speaking from a clean mind, a clear mind. A mind that's not tangled in ego, in control, in anger, or in fear. And when speech flows from that clarity, it sharpens everything inside you. Words don't vanish after they're spoken. They echo, not just in the ears of others, but in your own body, your own nervous system. Harsh words leave residue. They tighten the chest. They stir regret. And the more often they're used, the more the mind begins to live in that state, reactive, tense, foggy. But speech that is clean, honest, and purposeful clears the air not only around you, but within you. It creates a rhythm of thought that is stable and soft, and that rhythm becomes a kind of mental order. Right speech means watching for four things. Is it true? Is it useful? Is it kind? And is it necessary? These are not moral rules. They are tools for clarity, because untrue speech distorts the world. Useless speech scatters attention. Cruel speech poisons the heart, and unnecessary speech clutters the mind. Every time these are bypassed, the inner world gets louder. But when they're honored, mental space opens. Thought becomes lighter. Focus returns. This doesn't mean everything said must be profound. It just means it must be conscious. So much of what is spoken each day is automatic, complaining out of habit, gossiping to fill silence, arguing to feel control. But each of these becomes a thread in the web of mental noise, and over time, that web becomes thick. The mind feels trapped, but often it's the words that spun the trap. Complaining, for example, may feel like release, but it reinforces a lens that looks for what's wrong, and once that lens sets in, it doesn't just affect speech, it affects vision. The mind begins to see more problems, even where there are none. Gossip feels like bonding, but it breeds a subtle paranoia, a fear of being judged, a mistrust of stillness, and once the mind lives in that world, peace becomes harder to touch. Anger in speech often feels powerful, but it leaves a burn, one that lingers long after the conversation ends. Right speech breaks this cycle, not by forcing silence, but by returning speech to intention, by making it less about expression and more about alignment. What is being built with these words? What kind of mental climate is being created with each sentence? This is why monks practice silence, not because speech is bad, but because silence reveals how much of speech is unnecessary. And when that silence ends, their words carry more weight. They are not diluted, they are not scattered, they are clean. And that clarity changes not just how others hear them, but how they experience their own mind. But this isn't about being quiet all the time. Right speech includes speaking up. It includes saying hard things. It includes setting boundaries. But it does so without poison, without hidden motives, without ego wrapped around the message. It says what needs to be said, but nothing extra. It speaks truth, but without cruelty. It draws lines, but with compassion. And when this becomes practice, the effect on the mind is profound. Thoughts start organizing themselves. The habit of mental chaos begins to dissolve. Because if your words are clear, your thoughts must become clear to produce them. It's like brushing your teeth, but for the mind. Each moment of right speech is a cleansing, a polishing, and over time, the brain begins to crave that kind of order. Self-talk is part of this too. The words spoken to the self, though unheard by others, are still powerful. Telling yourself you're a failure, telling yourself you're behind, repeating stories of fear. These words shape your internal architecture. They tighten your perception. But when the inner voice becomes kind, true, and present, the mind follows. Self-speech sets the tone for all speech, and that tone echoes through every experience. Even silent speech, the narration that runs beneath your actions, can either cloud or clarify your attention. You're walking, and the mind says, "This is pointless." That's a thought. But it's also a sentence, and that sentence shapes how the walk feels. But if the narration says, "Just walk," the body softens, the breath deepens, presence returns. That's the power of speech, not just out loud, but inside. Right speech also makes relationships lighter, because when you stop using words to manipulate, defend, or inflate, connection becomes simple, honest, peaceful. Conversations become less about winning and more about understanding. Listening becomes easier, and silence becomes comfortable, not awkward, because you're no longer afraid of what isn't said. You're no longer filling space with noise to avoid facing yourself. This doesn't mean perfection. It means attention. You will still slip. Words will still come out wrong. But the difference is you'll notice. And in that noticing, growth begins. You'll catch yourself mid-sentence. You'll pause before responding. You'll ask yourself, is this adding clarity or confusion? And over time, that pause becomes your power. Right speech is also a protection. It protects the mind from self-sabotage. It protects others from harm. And it protects the heart from regret. Because when words come from integrity, there's nothing to clean up afterward, no emotional debris to sort through, just a clean break, a clear offering, and the calm that follows when you know you spoke well. This is mental hygiene in its truest form, not just silence, but skill, not just control, but care. And with every step in this practice, the mind becomes lighter, not because life got quieter, but because the noise inside is no longer multiplied through speech. So now, stay in that clarity. Let your words, even the silent ones, reflect your practice. Let them clean, not clutter. Let them serve truth, not reaction. And in that service, let your mind stay sharp, light, and kind, because when speech becomes clean, so does thought. And when thought becomes clean, clarity isn't something you chase, it's something that speaks through you, effortlessly, clearly, completely. Now that your speech has been cleansed, now that your words, both spoken and silent, have begun to align with presence instead of habit, you've already started shifting the architecture of your mind. You're not just choosing peace, you're building it. But as clarity expands, something else becomes visible. Underneath the surface of even the quietest minds, there are forces, subtle but powerful, that cloud judgment, distort perception, and interrupt inner stillness without warning. And they don't disappear just because we want them to. They only loosen their grip when we stop resisting them and begin recognizing them for what they are. This is where the next lesson begins. The Buddha called them the 5 hindrances, not as punishments, but as warning signs. 5 mental states that pollute attention, cloud wisdom, and poison clarity from within. These aren't flaws in your character, they're movements in the mind. And each one, if left unseen, becomes a fog. But once seen clearly, they dissolve. Not because you fought them, but because you stopped feeding them. The first hindrance is desire. Not the kind that inspires creativity or connection, but the restless craving that says, this moment isn't enough. It pulls the mind forward, always reaching, never satisfied. Desire tells you happiness is in the next thing, the next meal, message, moment. And while it feels like momentum, it's actually a loop, one that turns now into not yet. The problem isn't the wanting. The problem is the forgetting. Forgetting that the satisfaction you're chasing won't last. That even if you get what you want, the craving will return. Recognition untangles this. When you see desire as it rises, not with guilt, but with clarity, it starts to lose its grip. You stop chasing, and start observing. And in that observation, the craving burns out faster. The second is aversion, the mind's way of pushing life away. It shows up as irritation, anger, resentment, rejection. Aversion whispers, "This shouldn't be happening," and convinces you that the only way to feel better is to resist. But resistance creates friction. It locks the pain in place. Aversion narrows your view. It makes the heart tense and the thoughts sharp. But when it's seen clearly, without judgment, something softens. You begin to notice the tightness in the body, the heat behind the words, the story fueling the reaction. And just by seeing it, naming it gently, the fire starts to fade. You don't need to agree with what's happening. You just need to stop fighting the fact that it is. The third hindrance is sloth and torpor. Not simple tiredness, but the foggy heaviness that says, "Why bother?" It's the sleep of awareness, a kind of mental dullness that makes everything feel distant. This isn't laziness, it's disconnection. The body might be awake, but the mind has dimmed its lights, and the more it goes unnoticed, the heavier it becomes. But again, the answer isn't force, it's attention. It's sitting with the heaviness without identifying with it, feeling the pull to shut down and saying, "This is the mind wanting to sleep." And sometimes, just naming that is enough to bring light back in. The energy returns, not from pushing, but from presence. Next comes restlessness, the itch of the mind, the background buzz that keeps you scanning, adjusting, never settling. It says, "This isn't quite right. Try something else." It keeps you jumping, thought to thought, task to task, breath to breath. Restlessness is movement without purpose, the illusion of progress, and it wears down clarity like wind on glass. But once it's recognized, it can be soothed, not by fixing the mind, but by letting it land. You notice the urge to shift. You stay anyway. You let the mind be unsettled, and you watch it settle itself. That's the power of recognition, not as a trick, but as truth, because the mind doesn't need more motion. It needs more stillness. And then there's doubt, the quietest hindrance, and sometimes the deadliest. Not thoughtful questioning, but paralyzing uncertainty. The voice that says, "This practice doesn't work. You're not doing it right. None of this matters." Doubt poisons the roots of effort. It makes you hesitate. It creates a fog that turns even clarity into confusion. But the key to doubt is perspective, seeing it not as truth, but as a passing weather pattern. You don't need to silence it. You just need to recognize this is the mind doubting. Not you doubting, just a thought passing through. And when doubt is held like this, with distance, it shrinks. It no longer drives decisions. It becomes background noise, and clarity rises again. These hindrances aren't mistakes. They're human. Every mind meets them. The question isn't how to avoid them. It's how to relate to them. Suppression only strengthens them, but recognition softens them. Awareness turns toxins into teachers, and these hindrances rarely show up alone. Often they feed each other. Desire leads to restlessness. Restlessness leads to doubt. Doubt leads to aversion. Aversion leads to shutdown, and the loop continues. But any moment of awareness breaks the loop. You pause, you name what's present, and the grip loosens. Even now, you might notice one of them, a thought pulling you into the future, a bit of resistance in the chest, a fog over your eyes. A doubt about this very lesson, that's not a problem, that's the doorway. Each hindrance is a path back to clarity, not by conquering it, but by meeting it fully, without fear, without shame, just presence. And as this recognition becomes habit, the mind begins to purify, not in some moral sense, in a functional one. The fog lifts, the patterns weaken. Clarity becomes your default state. Not because the hindrances disappear forever, but because they no longer hold you captive. You'll still feel craving, but it won't drive you. You'll still feel anger, but it won't own you. You'll still feel tired, but it won't define you. You'll still feel doubt, but it won't derail you. That's real power, the kind that comes not from control, but from understanding. Buddhism doesn't ask for perfection, it asks for awareness. And nowhere is this more evident than with the 5 hindrances. You're not asked to never feel them, you're asked to notice them, to greet them, to sit beside them without becoming them. And through that, you begin to purify not just the surface of the mind, but its roots. So now, let this be your practice, noticing without resisting, naming without judging, meeting without merging. And in that practice, feel the mind lighten, not from adding anything, but from releasing what never belonged to you in the first place. You don't need to fight for clarity, you just need to stop feeding the fog. Now that you've seen the 5 hindrances for what they are, not enemies, but indicators, not flaws, but invitations to awareness, you've already started to purify the lens through which your mind sees the world. But there's something even more immediate than thought, even closer than emotion. It's always with you, always moving, always trying to tell you something. And most people overlook it because it's too simple to seem important. Yet when you truly begin to pay attention, it becomes one of the most honest teachers of the mind's hidden state. It's time to turn to the breath, not just to control it, but to understand it. The breath is a mirror. It reflects your state before your mind even forms a thought about it. Shallow breath reveals tension. A held breath shows fear. Long exhalations often accompany letting go, but the body doesn't wait for your thoughts to catch up. It responds immediately, and the breath is its signal. This isn't something you have to believe. It's something you can feel right now with your own attention. Most people only notice the breath when it becomes uncomfortable, during stress, exhaustion, or panic. But by then, the breath isn't the beginning of the story, it's the result. What this lesson invites is something quieter, learning to catch the breath in real time. Noticing how your internal weather shapes each inhale and each exhale, and in doing that, you begin to uncover patterns, deep ones, that have lived inside you without your awareness. Take stress, for example. When the mind enters a state of mental overload, the breath shortens. It lifts into the chest. It becomes erratic. Most never notice this change, but the body does. It prepares for danger. The nervous system tightens. The mind races, and without ever being aware of it, you're breathing like you're being chased. But if you were to pause and feel that breath, not change it, just feel it, you'd immediately gain insight into your internal state. You'd realize you're not calm, you're not grounded, and more importantly, you'd realize you weren't aware of how far you'd drifted from clarity until now. The breath doesn't lie, it doesn't hide, it simply reflects. So when you start observing it, not as a control strategy, but as a diagnostic tool, you begin to see not just the breath, but the mind behind it. That's when change becomes possible. Not because you forced calmness, but because you stopped reinforcing stress unconsciously. There's a rhythm that each breath carries, and it's not just physical, it's psychological. A rushed breath can be the residue of urgency. A silent breath may signal withdrawal. A jerky inhale could reveal internal resistance. And a long sigh might uncover something finally being released. But you only see this when you slow down enough to witness it. The breath speaks in a language that doesn't use words, and when you learn to listen, clarity deepens. Breathing, when unconscious, mirrors unconscious thought. That's why patterns in breath are often rooted in long-standing emotional habits. Some people spend decades breathing in a way that subtly reinforces anxiety or control, but they never think to look at the breath itself. They chase thoughts, rearrange plans, restructure routines, without realizing the breath has been holding the blueprint for years. Now that you've learned to sit inside the storm, not by controlling it, but by becoming the stillness at its center, what rises next isn't more chaos. It's memory, patterns, echoes from the past that resurface when the body is still, when the breath slows, when there's finally enough quiet for the deeper layers to speak. The storms outside may have calmed, but the storms within often linger, and they don't always arrive as stories. Sometimes they show up as mood, as hesitation, as tension with no clear origin. This is where mindfulness, or sati, becomes something deeper than staying present. It becomes a way to decode the loops that were written long ago but are still playing now. Mindfulness isn't just a tool to focus. It's a way to see what's been hiding behind your habits. It's not only about noticing what's happening, it's about understanding where it's coming from. The breath may anchor you in the now, but what it steadies you for is the unraveling of what came before, those old imprints that shaped your current reactions, your voice, your resistance, your emotional baseline. The mind doesn't forget pain, it stores it. Not always in memory, but in behavior, in subtle reactions, in inner rules like don't speak up, or stay in control, or never trust. These didn't come from logic, they came from experience, and if the experience was never fully felt, it left behind an echo, something unfinished that now repeats over and over through thoughts that feel like yours, but aren't rooted in the now. This is what sati uncovers, the layers beneath behavior, the hidden origins of why you pull away in joy, why tension flares in harmless moments, why your mind floods with doubts before anything begins. These aren't just tendencies, they're echoes, and until they're seen clearly, they run the show. Repetitive thought patterns don't exist without roots. That voice that always says, "This won't work," or "You're not ready," didn't appear randomly. It was shaped by something, an event, a message, a moment that went unprocessed. The purpose of mindfulness isn't to silence that voice. It's to sit beside it and listen deeply enough to hear where it started. You can't think your way out of old patterns. You have to witness them fully, without shrinking, without justifying. And this witnessing is not intellectual, it's felt. It means noticing when a thought arises and asking not just, "What is this thought saying?" but "Where did this come from?" Not as a judgment, as a curiosity. For example, you feel hesitation about something small, a conversation, a message, a change. You pause, you breathe, and instead of reacting, you drop attention into the body. You feel the tightness, the breath pattern, the sensation. You stay, and then you notice, this isn't about now. This feeling is familiar, it's old. Maybe it's the same anxiety you felt walking into a classroom at age 12, or the same silence you held when your opinion was once dismissed. And now, decades later, the echo is still here. But mindfulness brings it into the light. The moment that happens, something softens. Because now the pattern isn't unconscious, it's witnessed. And what's witnessed begins to transform, not by analysis, but by compassion. This is why presence is healing, not because it erases the past, but because it allows you to finally sit with the parts of you that were frozen in it. Sati doesn't rush this process. It watches gently, over and over. Every time an old thought arises, every time a story repeats, it offers space, not to fix, but to feel. That's how the loop begins to weaken, not by force, by familiarity. You recognize the pattern, you stay with it, you see how it moves, you learn its shape, and slowly it stops controlling you. This kind of presence requires patience, because echoes don't disappear on schedule. Some return over and over, asking for deeper attention. But each time you meet them without resistance, you reclaim a part of your clarity, a part of your voice, a part of your freedom. The body plays a key role in this, because so many echoes are somatic. They live in the chest, the stomach, the throat. The mind may have forgotten, but the body remembers. Sati invites you to listen to the body's language, not with interpretation, but with presence. A heaviness in the chest may not need explanation. It may just need space to move. The tightness in your jaw may not need to be named. It may just need to be noticed without flinching. This is how healing unfolds, not through solving, but through staying. Through showing up to the part of you that was never fully allowed to speak, not to agree with it, not to believe every story it tells, but to say, I'm here now, I see you. And in that seeing, the mind stops fighting, the loop stops spinning, and a new response becomes possible. This doesn't mean the past disappears. It means it stops driving the present. Because once the echo is seen, it no longer hides inside your choices. It no longer whispers doubt into your joy or fear into your stillness. It becomes part of the narrative, not the narrator. And from that place, you begin to live differently. Not because your story changed, but because your relationship to it did. You no longer have to protect it. You no longer have to prove anything to escape it. You're not trying to rewrite it. You're just not reenacting it. This is the deeper power of mindfulness. It's not just attention, it's liberation. Because attention is what allows memory to soften. It allows hurt to be felt without being relived. It allows the future to open without dragging the past into it. You don't have to analyze every moment of your history. You don't need to trace every echo back to the source. All you need is presence, deep, steady presence that listens without panic, that notices without grasping, that allows without collapse. Because when you meet the past with this kind of presence, the future stops looking like a threat. It becomes space. And that space is where new patterns can form, not as a performance, but as a reflection of who you actually are now. So stay here. Keep listening. Keep feeling. Let the echoes rise. Let them speak. Let them pass. You are not what happened. You are the awareness that's finally ready to listen. Now that the past has been listened to, not judged, not feared, but simply witnessed with the gentle steadiness of mindfulness, something begins to shift deep beneath the surface. The loops lose volume. The patterns lose grip. The weight that once dragged the present backward starts to lighten. But as this space opens, a question often arises. If I let go too much, will I stop caring? If I stop attaching, will I grow distant? This fear creates confusion around one of the most powerful teachings in Buddhism, detachment. It's often mistaken for emotional disconnection, when in truth, detachment is not the end of love. It's the beginning of a freer, deeper form of it. There's a fine line between detachment and disconnection. One opens the heart without clinging, the other closes it out of fear. One is rooted in presence, the other in escape, but both can look similar on the outside. Silence, space, stillness. The difference lies in the intention behind them. And when that intention becomes clear, the path toward mental clarity becomes easier to walk. Detachment is not turning away from life. It's turning toward it without needing to grip. It's experiencing things fully and letting them pass without trying to trap them in permanence. It's allowing joy to come without fearing its loss. It's letting sadness be felt without drowning in its story. It's presence without possession. Disconnection, on the other hand, is a defense. It says, if I care too much, I'll get hurt. It avoids, withdraws, freezes. It stops feeling to stay safe. But in trying to avoid pain, it avoids life. Disconnection creates emotional numbness. Detachment restores emotional balance. This difference matters because clarity depends on it. When the mind is disconnected, it stops receiving accurate information. It filters everything through distance. It stops listening, stops noticing the details. But when the mind is detached in the Buddhist sense, it becomes sharper. It hears more clearly. It sees what's present instead of what it wants. It doesn't need to edit reality. It meets it directly. Detachment brings a kind of warmth. It allows connection without expectation. It lets you be with others without needing them to behave a certain way. It lets you love without tying your peace to how that love is received. This isn't coldness. It's a deeper compassion, because it's not based on control. It's based on freedom. To understand detachment clearly, it helps to look at how attachment creates confusion. When you cling to outcomes, your perception narrows. You stop seeing people as they are and start seeing them through what you want them to give you. You stop hearing words and start interpreting them through fear. This attachment makes it hard to think clearly, to speak honestly, to act from wisdom instead of desperation. Detachment clears that space. It opens the mind, because now you're not leaning on every moment to validate your identity. You're not waiting for the next thing to go right before you feel okay. You're not using life to fix something that was never broken. This clarity doesn't mean you don't feel. It means you feel without losing your center. You grieve without collapsing. You celebrate without clinging. You forgive without needing to forget. This is balance. This is where the heart can stay open without becoming overwhelmed. In relationships, this is especially powerful. Attachment often leads to possession, jealousy, fear of abandonment. But detachment allows love to breathe. It creates room for both people to be whole. It respects boundaries. It honors change. It doesn't hold someone hostage to your expectations. And in daily life, Detachment simplifies everything. You no longer need every plan to unfold exactly as you imagined. You stop fearing interruptions. You stop obsessing over timelines. Because you're no longer building your worth on external structure. You've learned to live in the flow instead of fighting it. Disconnection, however, often hides beneath the surface. It says, "I don't care," when care would bring pain. It says, "I'm fine," when there's something deeper waiting to be acknowledged. It's a survival response, but it closes the door to intimacy. It quiets the mind, but not in a peaceful way, in a numbed way. That's why clarity can't grow in disconnection, because it's built on avoidance, not awareness. To move from disconnection to detachment, presence is needed. First, to notice the difference. Then, to choose openness again. This is not done all at once. It's done slowly, breath by breath. You catch yourself shutting down. You breathe, you soften. You don't force connection, but you stop running from it. Sometimes the body knows before the mind does. You feel yourself pulling away, tightening, retreating. That's a signal, not to push through, but to pause and ask, am I detaching or disconnecting? If it's detachment, there will be peace in the release. If it's disconnection, there will be numbness, tension, or avoidance. Detachment can even bring you closer to others. Because when you're not trying to change them or predict their next move, you actually listen. You see them more clearly. You meet them where they are, not where your fear wants them to be. That's why detachment leads to compassion, because it lets you love someone even when they're messy, even when they're distant, even when they change. And that same compassion turns inward. You detach from the need to be perfect, from the need to heal by a certain date, from the idea that clarity means never feeling lost again. You become your own steady presence. You stop demanding that your feelings make sense. You just feel them. You stop needing your thoughts to align. You just watch them. That is freedom, not escape, but space. This space doesn't lead to isolation. It leads to ease. It lets you hold things lightly, not because they don't matter, but because you know you can't keep them. You experience more, not less. You engage more deeply, not more distantly, because there's nothing clogging your perception. No need to manage every outcome, no pressure to keep every piece in place. Even goals, dreams, and creativity shift under this lens. When you detach, your work becomes cleaner. You're not creating to impress. You're not producing to prove. You're expressing. You're contributing. You're sharing. And the result is lighter, freer, more aligned with truth. So now, stay here. In this middle ground between gripping and withdrawing, between holding and releasing. Let your care remain, but let it breathe. Let your presence deepen, but don't clutch. Let your heart open, but keep your roots in stillness. Because detachment doesn't end connection. It clears the noise so love can move through. Now that the heart has been opened without clinging, now that connection no longer depends on possession and care, no longer demands control, the mind begins to experience a kind of quiet it may not recognize. Not an emptiness that feels hollow, but a stillness that feels full. There's a softening where there used to be pressure, a calm where there used to be speed, and what rises from this stillness isn't more information. It isn't a new idea to chase or another insight to analyze. It's something older, something deeper, an understanding that doesn't need to be built, only revealed. And it begins when the mind finally dares to do something it has avoided for a very long time. Stop thinking so much. The modern mind is a busy place, constant movement, endless content, rapid comparison. Even the spiritual path can become cluttered. There's always another concept to grasp, another perspective to integrate, another answer to uncover. But the wisdom that matters most often arrives when the noise quiets down. It doesn't enter as a breakthrough. It emerges as what was always there, hidden under layers of interpretation. Mental simplicity isn't ignorance. It isn't about knowing less. It's about needing less in order to see more clearly. It's a return to what's obvious, what's direct, what's true, before thought begins to explain it. This simplicity doesn't strip depth away. It uncovers it. It reveals the vastness that thinking tries to shrink into something manageable, something safe. The idea that spiritual depth comes from accumulating ideas is itself a misunderstanding. True clarity doesn't come from collecting more. It comes from releasing what clutters. The moment the mind stops chasing complexity, it meets life as it is. And in that meeting, there's a knowing that's hard to describe and impossible to fake. There's a difference between thinking about peace and being peaceful, between analyzing love and feeling it, between discussing presence and living in it. The mental world loves discussion. It wants to define, compare, debate. But there is a point in every path where the mind has to fall silent, where truth can't be spoken, but only felt. That's not the end of intelligence. It's the beginning of wisdom. Spiritual depth doesn't require intellectual gymnastics. It requires honesty, stillness, simplicity, a willingness to let go of needing to understand everything and instead just sit with what's here. Most people think they need to figure things out before they can relax, but often it's the relaxing that reveals what no amount of figuring ever could. The reason deeper truths feel out of reach isn't because they're complicated, it's because they're buried. Buried under thoughts about how life should be, buried under concepts we were taught, roles we think we have to play, goals that were never really ours. And the more we try to think our way to freedom, the tighter those layers become. Simplicity is radical because it removes the escape routes. It brings you face to face with this breath, this feeling, this moment. And in that rawness, something begins to shine through that has nothing to do with solving a problem or improving a self. It has to do with presence, with reality, with being. This kind of knowing doesn't need proof. It doesn't argue. It doesn't rush to be validated. It's felt in the body, in the silence between thoughts, in the way your heart softens when you stop trying to perform clarity and actually allow it. Simplicity clears the mind so that you can hear what's been waiting underneath all along. This doesn't mean thinking is bad. Thinking has its place. It helps us navigate, communicate, build. But when the mind becomes addicted to thinking, it loses access to a deeper kind of seeing. It starts living in commentary instead of experience. It becomes a reporter, not a participant. Mental simplicity invites the opposite. It invites you to stop explaining and start observing, to stop managing your experience and start feeling it, to stop constructing meaning and start noticing the meaning that's already embedded in every breath, every sound, every sensation. There's a quiet confidence that arises from this. Not because you've figured everything out, but because you've stopped needing to. There's strength in not reacting. There's power in pausing. There's clarity in simply being here, without the pressure to make it more than it is. This isn't detachment, it's intimacy. Because the less you filter experience through thought, the more directly you can meet it. You taste food more vividly. You hear music more deeply. You feel connection more purely. You begin to realize how much of your life was lived inside the mind's commentary about it, rather than inside the life itself. Simplicity also clears the path for action. Decisions become easier when there's less noise. Communication becomes cleaner when there's less internal debate. Boundaries become clearer when they're not tangled in mental confusion. You stop second-guessing every impulse. You trust what arises, not because it's perfect, but because it's aligned with presence. Even spiritual concepts begin to fade. The words that once felt profound become unnecessary. You no longer need to describe what stillness is. You live it. You no longer try to define love. You offer it. You don't perform wisdom. You reflect it wordlessly in how you meet the world. The idea of knowing less to understand more stops being a riddle and starts being a way of life. You begin to see that most answers were always waiting beneath the questions, that most peace was always present beneath the analysis, that most connection was always available beneath the stories of separation. Letting go of mental complexity doesn't make you dull. It makes you clear. It brings you back to the root of everything: breath, body, heart, silence. These are not things you need to think about. They are things you need to feel into, return to, trust. Even now, as you read these words, something in you already knows this. Not because it was explained, but because it was remembered. Because somewhere underneath the layers of thinking, you've always known that simplicity doesn't mean smallness. It means spaciousness. So let the layers drop. Let the effort go. Let the commentary fade. You don't need more thoughts to go deeper. You need less of what pulls you away from what's already here. And what's here is not just enough. It's everything. Now that the layers of thought have quieted, now that simplicity has been reclaimed as the gateway to clarity rather than a loss of intelligence, something deeper begins to surface. Not in the form of new insight, but in the way time feels. Slower, softer, less urgent. That change isn't accidental. It's the natural result of releasing the mental pressure to solve, to control, to always be moving toward the next thing. And in this softened relationship with time, the next teaching emerges, not as a new practice, but as a shift in perception. A shift that Buddhists have been pointing to for centuries, that most urgency isn't real, it's created. And that dissolving the illusion of urgency is one of the fastest ways to regain clarity, calm, and presence. Urgency is rarely about what's happening. It's about what the mind believes should be happening instead. It's a contraction, a tightening around the present moment, a silent message that says, "This isn't enough. You need to move faster, do more, fix something." It creates the illusion that peace is on the other side of effort, that happiness will arrive once this one last thing is handled. But that moment never arrives, because urgency keeps shifting the finish line. This is what Buddhist time perception challenges, not with slogans, but with direct awareness. It brings attention to the actual experience of now, not the mind's commentary about it. It reveals that when attention lands fully in the present, the idea of running out of time begins to dissolve. The breath slows, the pressure eases, and the mind sees that it wasn't the task that caused the panic. It was the belief about how fast it needed to be done. Urgency feels like importance. It dresses itself as responsibility, ambition, care. But often, it's just fear in disguise, fear of falling behind, of not being enough, of missing out. This fear is what drives the mental clock to spin faster, but no amount of racing ever brings peace. Only presence does, and presence can't be rushed. When the Buddhist tradition speaks of time, it doesn't deny its movement. It simply removes its tyranny. It points out that the future is always imagined, that the past is always a memory, and that the only place anything ever actually happens is now. From this view, time doesn't need to be managed. It needs to be met, and in that meeting, urgency fades. This doesn't mean you stop planning or caring. It means you stop believing that rushing will get you there better. Because what rushing actually does is fog the mind. It increases mistakes. It weakens intuition. It turns simple decisions into crises. When urgency rules, clarity can't function, because urgency doesn't leave room to listen. Slowing down isn't laziness. It's intelligence. It means giving the nervous system a chance to process fully. It means pausing before reacting. It means noticing the body's signals instead of overriding them. Most of the time, when something feels urgent, the best move is to pause, to take one breath, to feel what's real, because that single pause often reveals that the pressure wasn't coming from the situation. It was coming from the mind's relationship to it. This is where Buddhist awareness brings power. It creates space between stimulus and response. It allows time to stretch, just enough for wisdom to enter. You don't stop acting, you just stop rushing. You don't stop caring, you just stop panicking. You make space for grounded clarity instead of chaotic reaction. This shift also reveals how often urgency is used as a form of self-importance. I have so much to do becomes a badge of value. I'm behind becomes a reason to stay anxious. But the truth is, most urgency adds nothing to the outcome. It just drains energy. It makes you tired faster. And what you produce under pressure often carries that tightness with it. When time becomes something you're racing against, you stop participating in life. You start performing it. You treat each hour like a transaction, each minute like a threat. But from the Buddhist view, time isn't chasing you, it's unfolding around you, and your role isn't to beat it, it's to move with it. This doesn't mean abandoning deadlines or structure. It means returning to the present moment as the only reliable ground. It means realizing that clarity doesn't live in tomorrow. It lives in your ability to fully engage right now. Even if you're busy, even if the clock is ticking, the task can be done. The meeting can be held. The work can unfold. But without the internal fire that burns you from the inside. This shift also affects how you view others. When you drop urgency, you stop demanding people match your pace. You become more patient, more understanding, more willing to wait. And this patience isn't passivity, it's a gift. It says, I see you beyond the speed of your output. And that space heals. It invites presence from others simply by offering it yourself. When urgency dissolves, priorities become clearer. You stop trying to do everything at once. You stop filling every moment with noise. You start choosing with care. And those choices carry your full energy, not the scattered remnants left after racing through your day. Even your breath responds. It deepens. It settles. Because the body knows when the war with time has stopped. And in that stillness, you begin to move differently, speak differently, even rest differently. Because now, rest isn't something you earn, it's something you honor. This is what Buddhist time perception teaches, not through abstraction, but through experience. It shows that the clock is real, but the panic isn't. That the deadlines exist, but the drama is optional. That there's a different way to meet your life, one that doesn't rush past it. So right now, as you sit here, let time be what it is. Let this moment stretch. Let the next thing wait. Let the mind slow its grip on what's next and return to what's here, because there's nothing urgent about this breath. And in that truth, there's freedom. You don't need more time. You need less war with it. Now that the illusion of urgency has softened, now that the war with time has ended and space has returned to each breath, the mind becomes ready for something subtler, a shift not in pace, but in precision. Because even with time reclaimed, even with pressure gone, there's still a garden inside the mind, and that garden is always growing something. What it grows depends on where attention is placed and where energy flows. Not every thought deserves to bloom. Not every seed needs to be watered. This is where right effort begins, not as striving, but as a mindful choice to feed what's clear, calm, and true, and to let the rest go untouched. Right effort is one of the 8 spokes of the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path. It's not the effort of force. It's not about pushing harder. It's not about productivity or perfection. It's the discipline of direction. It asks the question, where is your energy going? Not just your physical energy, but your mental energy, your attention, your focus, your internal dialogue. In every moment, thoughts arise. Some are helpful, some are neutral, some are deeply harmful. But most people treat them all the same, giving each one equal weight, believing each one equally, feeding every thought with the same attention. Right effort interrupts that. It says, you don't have to feed every thought that knocks. You don't have to water every seed. You don't have to let every story grow. This is mental clarity, not through thinking more, but through thinking more intentionally. It's not about controlling your mind, it's about curating it. Not in a rigid way, but in a kind, intelligent way. You learn to notice when a thought brings tension, fear, or confusion. And you gently ask, is this worth continuing? Is this a path I want to strengthen? Right effort starts with awareness, because you can't choose if you don't see. It's about catching yourself in the moment a thought begins to grow. Maybe it's a worry, maybe it's a judgment, maybe it's a fantasy. The habit might be to follow it automatically, but right effort offers a pause, a breath, a moment of decision. Do I want to energize this? If the answer is no, the practice is simple, not easy, but simple. You don't argue with the thought, you don't fight it, you don't try to make it go away, you just stop giving it fuel. You redirect, you choose another focus. You let that thought fade the way an untended fire goes cold. This isn't repression, it's wise attention. It's choosing what you want to cultivate, because the truth is, every thought you feed becomes stronger. Every loop you entertain becomes deeper. Every reaction you repeat becomes faster. But the opposite is also true. What you don't feed weakens. What you don't rehearse fades. And what you choose to nurture, thoughts of kindness, clarity, gratitude, patience, those become your new default. This is the garden. This is the filter. Right effort helps you tend to your inner world like a skilled gardener. You don't try to uproot every weed by force. You just stop watering them. You focus on what you want to grow. And slowly, the inner landscape changes, not through willpower, but through wise selection. The Buddha described 4 dimensions of right effort. The first is preventing unwholesome thoughts from arising. This is proactive. It means noticing your triggers, your patterns, the places where confusion tends to begin, and avoiding the conditions that stir it up. Not because you're avoiding life, but because you're protecting your peace. The second is abandoning unwholesome thoughts that have already arisen. This is responsive. It means seeing the thought clearly once it's arrived and choosing not to continue it. Maybe you're halfway into a judgment. Maybe you've already begun an inner argument. Right effort means you can still stop, still step back, still return to clarity. The third is cultivating wholesome thoughts that have not yet arisen. This is the planting phase. You intentionally bring in thoughts that lift, thoughts that align with truth, thoughts that soften the heart. Gratitude, forgiveness, curiosity, generosity. These don't always arise on their own. Sometimes they need to be invited. And the fourth is maintaining and developing wholesome thoughts that have already arisen. This is the nurturing phase. You recognize the value of what's already blooming in your mind, and you protect it. You give it time. You strengthen it with repetition. This is how clarity becomes not just a moment, but a way of being. Right effort also transforms how you deal with negativity. Instead of feeling guilty for negative thoughts, you see them as opportunities to redirect. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by your mind, you remember, not everything it says is true, not every feeling is a fact, and not every thought needs to be followed to the end. This is how the mind becomes lighter, not because every thought is positive, but because every thought is chosen. Not because you stop feeling, but because you stop reinforcing the thoughts that keep you stuck. Over time, this makes a huge difference. It rewires your habits. It reconditions your patterns. It makes peace the default, not because everything's perfect, but because you stopped feeding what isn't. Right effort also brings humility. You begin to see how often your thoughts are reactions, not reflections. How often your mind creates tension that has nothing to do with reality. And instead of trying to control everything outside of you, you take responsibility for what's inside, not out of blame, but out of empowerment. You also learn patience, because some thoughts won't dissolve right away. Some have been fed for years. They'll return. They'll test you. But every time you choose not to water them, their roots loosen. And that's the practice. Not perfection, but consistency. Not resisting what's present, but refusing to grow what doesn't serve. Even now, the thoughts that want your energy are waiting. Some will try to pull you back into the past. Some will tempt you into imagining futures that haven't happened. Some will whisper fear. Some will shout doubt. But you're not helpless. You're not at the mercy of their momentum. You have a choice, right now. Which ones are worth your breath, your time, your life? Because every thought you follow, you become. Every mental seed you water, you plant again. And every time you pause, notice, and choose, you clear space for something better to grow. You don't need to control your mind. You just need to stop feeding what clouds it. Now that right effort has revealed the power of intentional attention, now that the garden of the mind has been tended with care and the choice of which thoughts to energize has become conscious, there's a deeper layer of clarity waiting to unfold, not through effort, but through release, not by building more structure in the mind, but by realizing the illusion of needing any structure at all. What comes next is not about improving the inner world. It's about seeing through it. And that seeing begins with one of the most profound teachings in Buddhist philosophy: sunyata, or emptiness. A word that at first sounds hollow, but when truly understood, reveals the most spacious kind of freedom. Emptiness does not mean nothingness. It doesn't mean life lacks meaning, or that feelings are false, or that existence is cold. That's not emptiness. That's nihilism. Sunyata, in its real form, is the wisdom that nothing in reality has fixed, independent existence. Not your thoughts, not your emotions, not your roles, not even the sense of self. Everything arises in connection. Everything exists in relation. Everything is impermanent, conditioned, and interdependent. This may sound abstract, but the experience of emptiness is incredibly practical. It changes how the mind holds everything. It removes the pressure to define, to cling, to make something permanent out of what is always moving. It's not the loss of meaning, it's the loss of distortion. It's not detachment from life. It's the freedom to meet life without gripping. Most suffering comes not from pain itself, but from the belief that what we're feeling or fearing or wanting has to be fixed, permanent, or protected. The mind wants to hold things in place. It wants something solid to stand on. But reality doesn't give us that. Everything changes. Every situation evolves. Every identity fades. Emptiness reveals this not as a tragedy, but as truth. When the mind believes that something is solid, like the idea of who you are, or who someone else is, or how life should look, it starts to resist anything that challenges that belief, and that resistance becomes suffering. But when the mind sees that nothing is truly fixed, it stops clinging. And that stopping isn't passive, it's powerful, because it frees attention, it frees perception, it allows clarity to return where confusion used to live. Sunyata points out that things appear real, but they are not independently real. Like a wave on the ocean, it has shape, it has motion, it has energy, but it has no independent life. It depends on the water, it depends on the wind, it depends on causes and conditions. Your thoughts are the same, your moods, your memories, your entire identity. They rise and fall just like that wave. Understanding emptiness isn't about dismissing what you feel. It's about seeing that what you feel isn't you. It's not a permanent possession. It's an experience passing through awareness. You don't need to suppress it, but you also don't need to attach to it. You don't have to believe every story it tells. You just need to see its nature. This seeing opens up a new kind of clarity. A mind that sees emptiness is no longer fooled by the surface. It no longer panics when a mood shifts. It no longer grasps when a joy fades. It no longer defines itself by the roles it plays, the achievements it collects, or the fears it has carried for years. It simply meets what's here without turning it into something heavier than it is. Even your problems begin to look different in the light of emptiness. What once felt like a personal flaw becomes just another conditioned pattern. What once felt like a crisis becomes a changing situation. What once felt like failure becomes feedback, not because you don't care, but because you've stopped believing the problem is as solid as your mind once made it. Sunyata also dissolves pride and shame, because when there is no fixed self, there's nothing to defend and nothing to define. Success doesn't inflate the ego. Failure doesn't crush it. Emptiness brings balance because it reveals that the self is not a statue to protect, but a process to witness. This doesn't make you less engaged with life. It makes you more flexible, more curious, more compassionate. Because when you're not clinging to labels, you can actually listen. When you're not stuck in identity, you can actually change. When you're not fighting to hold reality still, you can actually move with it. Even your relationships shift in the presence of emptiness. You stop expecting people to stay the same. You stop needing them to fulfill roles. You begin to love them not as concepts, but as living, breathing, changing beings. This love is freer. It's lighter. Because it's not holding on, it's showing up. This also applies to your inner world. You stop expecting your mind to be always calm, always clear, always wise. You let it be what it is, and in that acceptance, clarity grows, not from control, but from understanding. Meditation often deepens this insight. You sit, you breathe, you notice thoughts rising and falling, sensations coming and going, identities forming and dissolving. And after a while, something becomes clear, not intellectually, but experientially. Nothing in the mind stays. Everything is a movement. And what watches that movement is untouched. That watcher is not a self. It's not a fixed I. It's awareness itself, open, spacious, non-clinging. And when you rest in that awareness, even for a moment, the need to make everything mean something heavy disappears. You don't become empty in the hollow sense. You become empty in the liberating sense, free of fixations, free of false ground, free of the inner tension that comes from trying to make what's fluid into something solid. This doesn't mean life stops mattering. It means you stop confusing mattering with permanence. You stop thinking love only counts if it lasts forever. You stop thinking peace only counts if it's uninterrupted. You stop thinking identity only counts if it's consistent. You realize that what matters is how you meet each moment, not how tightly you hold on to it. Sunyata reveals that clarity doesn't come from knowing more. It comes from clinging less, from letting go of the need for the moment to be different than it is, from allowing things to come and allowing them to go without fighting either. Even your goals, your dreams, your visions, they shift when seen through emptiness. You still care, you still move, but you stop attaching your worth to the outcome. You stop measuring your progress by how much you've secured. You begin to trust that the movement itself, the offering, the action, the presence, is enough. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you wise, because now your action comes from clarity, not craving. Your decisions come from awareness, not fear. Your words come from freedom, not defense. So now, as this stillness continues to unfold, let the need to grip dissolve. Let the need to define fall away. Let the shape of this moment be whatever it is. There's nothing to hold. And in that letting go, everything becomes clear. Now that emptiness has been felt, not as void, but as vision, not as absence, but as the wide space where clarity arises, another layer of resistance starts to dissolve. Not the resistance to thoughts or emotions, but to stillness itself. Because when the distractions fall away, when nothing is left to cling to or control, a strange sensation often surfaces. Not fear, not excitement, just discomfort. The mind calls it boredom, but that label is misleading. What's actually being felt is the edge of raw presence, the beginning of deeper seeing. And if you don't run from it, if you stay, something starts to open. Boredom is rarely understood for what it really is. It's not the absence of stimulation. It's the tension that arises when the mind doesn't have anything new to chew on, when entertainment stops, when thinking slows, when the usual rhythm of chasing, solving, and avoiding gets interrupted. In that silence, the mind grows uneasy. It looks for something to grab, and if nothing presents itself, it labels the moment as boring. But that moment isn't empty. It's full. It's just not full of distraction. Mental clarity often starts right here, on the other side of that uneasy stillness. Because boredom is the surface layer that sits on top of restlessness. And restlessness sits on top of avoidance. Avoidance of what? Avoidance of being. Of truly being where you are, without agenda, without noise, without something to solve. When you stop moving, the mental dust begins to settle. But before it clears, it swirls. That swirl is boredom, that in-between state. Not yet busy, not yet quiet, just unsettled. And it's at this threshold that most people leave. They open the phone, they change the task, they distract. Not because the moment is painful, but because it's unfamiliar. Boredom is not a flaw in the moment. It's a sign that the mind hasn't yet learned how to rest without stimulation. And that's exactly why it's such a valuable teacher. Because in that discomfort is an invitation to stay, to breathe, to look beneath the story that nothing is happening. Because what's actually happening is that your inner world is revealing itself. The Buddhist path doesn't glamorize boredom, but it does ask you to stay with it. Because what's behind boredom is space, and what's behind space is clarity. But clarity can't arrive if the mind keeps fleeing the entrance. And boredom is the entrance. It's the moment where the mind starts to unwind its addiction to distraction. This isn't about forcing stillness. It's about meeting the stillness that's already there and realizing that your discomfort is not a problem. It's a doorway, a shifting of gears, a transition from outer orientation to inner depth. Most people never reach that depth because they're unwilling to sit with the transition. But once you do, once you sit long enough to feel the full arc of boredom, you start to see its edges soften. You start to notice the thoughts behind the boredom, the impulses that pull you, the stories that whisper, "This isn't enough." And when those begin to quiet, something quieter still begins to speak. This is where mental clarity is born, not in the peak of stimulation, but in the valley that comes after it, in the space where nothing new is arriving, where you're simply sitting, simply being, and that being reveals everything the busyness had covered up. Boredom also shows you your cravings, not just for food or fun, but for meaning, for validation, for novelty. The moment you stop feeding those cravings, they rise, they try to pull you back. But if you stay, if you breathe through that rising, they pass, and what remains is presence, unpolished, quiet, open. The more time you spend in that space, the less afraid you become of it, the more familiar it feels. What once felt dull becomes rich. What once felt empty becomes luminous. The details become sharper. The breath becomes more textured. The silence becomes less silent. And in that shift, the mind learns a new kind of clarity. Not the clarity that solves things, but the clarity that sees things. This is not a trick. It's not a shortcut. It's a retraining, a rewiring, a willingness to unlearn the idea that every moment must be filled, that every gap must be closed, that every second must entertain or educate or produce. Boredom teaches you to rest in the gaps, to see that the gaps are not blank spaces, they are breathing spaces, healing spaces, listening spaces. When you practice staying with boredom, you stop needing life to always deliver something. You stop needing your mind to always be doing something. You begin to trust that presence is enough, that simply being alive is already an experience worth meeting. This changes everything. Your relationship with time shifts. You stop counting minutes and start inhabiting them. Your relationship with work shifts. You stop needing constant stimulation and start bringing more attention to fewer things. Even your creativity changes, because the mind that isn't constantly fed starts to generate its own light. Boredom also reveals the mind's patterns, its reflexes, its fears. And when you watch those patterns without feeding them, they weaken. The boredom begins to feel less sharp, more like space, more like quiet readiness, a place from which real insight can rise. Even your emotional life deepens, because now you're not running from discomfort, you're not addicted to excitement, you're not numbing yourself with thought, you're staying, and in that staying, emotions become less reactive, more honest, more manageable, because the mind isn't amplifying them with restlessness. Meditation isn't the only place this happens. You can meet boredom in a line, in traffic, in the middle of a slow day. These are all chances to soften your demand for something more, to settle into what is. And the more you practice this, the more you'll see that boredom doesn't mean life is lacking. It means your mind is detoxing from excess. Even now, as this stillness deepens, you may notice that the mind wants to label it, to interpret it. But you don't need to. Just stay. Just feel. Just notice the quiet as it unfolds. Let the thoughts that say, "This isn't productive," pass. Let the urge to move dissolve, because on the other side of boredom is not more activity. It's a clarity that was always waiting, just beneath the noise. Now that stillness has been met without needing to escape it, now that boredom has been experienced not as emptiness, but as the first step into depth, another kind of clarity begins to emerge, not through silence alone, but through balance. The mind, now quieter, starts to reveal its patterns more clearly, and within those patterns, a new challenge appears. The habit of extremes, the tendency to swing between too much and too little, between obsession and avoidance, between overthinking and shutting down. The Buddhist path has a word for the escape from this mental seesaw, the middle way. And in the realm of thought, it offers not just peace, but stability. The mind loves extremes because they feel decisive. Rigid certainty feels safe. Complete denial feels convenient. But both are forms of imbalance. When the mind runs to extremes, it avoids the work of staying steady. It either amplifies everything or represses what it doesn't want to face. Neither route leads to clarity. One creates noise, the other creates numbness. The middle way of thought begins by stepping back from this inner tug-of-war. It asks not for neutrality in the shallow sense, but for wisdom in the deep sense. It recognizes that both overthinking and repression are distortions. Overthinking adds layers that confuse. Repression removes awareness, that could have brought understanding. The middle way doesn't avoid thought. It refines it. It uses thought when needed and lets it rest when it's not. This path begins with noticing when thought is no longer serving. A mind stuck in loops isn't processing, it's circling. Replaying the past again and again isn't clarity. It's fear trying to disguise itself as preparation. But swinging the other way, trying not to think about something at all, doesn't solve it either. Pushing thoughts away buries them. They don't disappear. They return. They wait for quieter moments. And when they do, they return stronger, harder to trace. So the middle way doesn't rush to solve or ignore. It observes. It sits with thought long enough to understand its root, but not so long that it becomes entangled. This is balance. This is what stops emotional surges from becoming mental spirals. It's what prevents reflection from becoming obsession. You allow thought, but you don't drown in it. One way to recognize imbalance is by checking your pace. Obsessive thought races. Repressive thought freezes. Balanced thought breathes. It moves at the pace of presence. It has rhythm. It arises, is seen, and is allowed to pass or unfold without force. This mental pacing changes how emotion is processed, how decisions are made, and how clarity is maintained. Another sign of imbalance is the tone of your thinking. Is it loud, harsh, circular? That's a clue. The middle way often speaks softly. It's the tone of curiosity, not critique. Inquiry, not interrogation. You're not trying to trap the truth, you're trying to invite it. This tone creates an internal space that is compassionate enough for truth to emerge without pressure. Balanced thinking also understands timing. Some thoughts don't need answers right away. Some truths take time to ripen. The middle way respects this. It doesn't rush insight. It doesn't force conclusions. It holds the question gently and lets the answer come when it's ready. This prevents premature closure and leaves room for a fuller view to form. Practicing the middle way of thought also involves noticing extremes in the content of your thinking. All or nothing narratives, catastrophic predictions, absolute self-judgments. These are red flags. They show the mind has fallen out of balance. Balanced thought recognizes complexity. It sees gray. It holds nuance. It allows for change. For example, instead of "I always mess up," balanced thought says, "That didn't go well. What can I learn?" Instead of "This is hopeless," it says, "This is hard right now." The middle way doesn't deny difficulty. It just doesn't collapse into it. And this changes everything, because it gives the mind a foothold in moments where it used to spiral. Even in conflict with others, this mindset helps. Instead of jumping to blame or withdrawing completely, you hold space for understanding. Instead of making it about who's right, you ask what's real. You listen not just to respond, but to reflect. This creates dialogue where there used to be defensiveness. It creates pause where there used to be pressure. The middle way also helps with self-reflection. You stop tearing yourself apart for your flaws, but you also stop pretending they're not there. You meet yourself honestly, without harshness or avoidance. And from that place, real growth becomes possible. Because now your efforts are rooted in clarity, not shame. Even in spiritual practice, this balance is vital. The mind can try too hard to be still, turning meditation into tension. Or It can get lazy, using detachment as an excuse not to look deeper. The middle way shows that real practice is alive. It's alert without being rigid. It's restful without being passive. It adapts. It learns. It returns. This kind of thinking doesn't make you indecisive. It makes you deliberate. It gives you the strength to wait when waiting is wise, and the clarity to act when action is needed. It replaces the drama of extremes with the calm of discernment. And from that calm, your choices become cleaner, your focus sharpens, your heart softens, even your creativity expands, because now your ideas aren't being smothered by fear or inflated by fantasy. They're being shaped by presence, by patience, by a mind that is spacious enough to allow thought to rise and fall without clinging to either. This path doesn't mean you never struggle. It means your struggle no longer owns you. You learn to recognize when the pendulum is swinging too far, and you bring it back, gently, repeatedly, until balance becomes the new default. Not perfect balance, not rigid symmetry, but a lived center, a mental posture that holds without gripping. So as this journey continues, let your thoughts arise. Let them speak. Let them soften. Don't chase them. Don't silence them. Just meet them from the middle. Not too much, not too little, just enough to stay clear. Now that balance has been restored, not by avoiding thought and not by drowning in it, but by staying in the middle of its motion, something subtle begins to reveal itself. A final tension, softer than the rest. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It's not the chaos of thinking too much or the silence of avoiding thought. It's the craving for something higher, the thirst for clarity itself. The mind, even in its pursuit of peace, can become restless again, only this time in spiritual disguise. And what comes next is not about doing more or refining technique. It's about recognizing the deepest paradox of all, that the pursuit of clarity can cloud the mind as much as confusion ever did. There's a moment on every inner path when the seeker becomes addicted to seeking, when the idea of spiritual progress turns into another project, when peace becomes a goal to chase, when insight becomes another trophy to earn. It's not wrong to want to understand, but when the wanting tightens, when it becomes grasping, the very thing you're chasing slips further away, because clarity, like the breath, only returns when it's not being clutched. This craving doesn't look like other cravings. It's not loud or obvious. It often shows up as diligence, as commitment. But underneath that effort is a subtle strain, the pressure to arrive, to become someone enlightened, to hold on to each insight like it's the key. This pressure becomes its own cloud. It narrows vision. It adds weight. It pulls the mind out of presence and back into becoming. What makes this trap difficult to see is that it feels virtuous. Who wouldn't want to be more aware, more peaceful, more compassionate? But when clarity becomes an identity, something to own or prove, it no longer liberates. It binds. And the mind begins chasing silence the way it once chased stimulation, seeking answers the way it once sought validation. The surface has changed. The habit hasn't. This is the final unhooking, the realization that even the desire for clarity must be surrendered, not repressed, not denied, just seen. Seen for what it is. Another movement of mind, another wave in awareness, another thought claiming that something is missing. When that thought is believed, even practice becomes pressure, Even wisdom becomes work. True clarity doesn't come from squeezing harder. It comes from softening the grip, from allowing what is without demanding it become something else. The mind's habit is to fix, improve, analyze, but the deeper movement is different. It's about trust, not passive resignation, but quiet confidence. Confidence that awareness itself is enough. That insight doesn't need to be hunted, it only needs to be uncovered. Letting go of the craving for clarity means being willing to not know, to not always feel certain, to not always see where it's going. And that's where the paradox lives. Because it's only when the need to understand fades that real understanding begins to rise, effortless, whole, and unexpected. This is where presence returns, not as a practice, but as a default. You stop meditating to achieve peace. You meditate because you're at peace. You stop journaling to become clear. You journal because you are clear. You stop trying to become something better. You return to the space where nothing was ever lacking. Unhooking from the craving means you don't chase what you've already tasted. You allow clarity to visit when it wants, and you don't panic when it doesn't. You stop measuring progress. You stop asking if it's working. You start noticing what's already here and how little needs to be added for it to be enough. This surrender doesn't make you passive, it makes you more alive. Because your energy is no longer split between experience and expectation. You're not looking over the moment's shoulder, you're in it. And from that fullness, the mind stops spinning, the breath deepens, the body settles, and clarity, the kind that can't be manufactured, arrives. This doesn't mean you abandon curiosity. It means your curiosity becomes softer, less urgent, more spacious. You're no longer demanding answers. You're exploring, you're witnessing, you're open to being surprised, and in that openness, insight grows, not like a conclusion, but like a flower, slowly, naturally, without strain. Even when confusion returns, and it will, it's no longer threatening. Because now, clarity isn't your identity. It's your guest, a visitor, not a possession. You welcome it. And when it leaves, you don't chase, you don't collapse, you wait. And waiting doesn't feel like emptiness anymore. It feels like presence. You also stop comparing. There's no more pressure to be further along, to feel what someone else feels, to arrive at some imagined state of constant calm. You see that everyone's clarity looks different, that no one holds it all the time. That insight is not a status. It's a movement, a wave, and your only job is to stay open when it comes and kind when it goes. Even your relationship with spiritual practice shifts. You stop turning meditation, mindfulness, or study into a competition. You stop clinging to the moments that felt transcendent. You stop judging the ones that didn't. You begin to see that the practice isn't there to give you a feeling. It's there to remind you of your nature, and that nature doesn't need proof. It doesn't need clarity to be real. Letting go of the craving also dissolves the subtle fear underneath it. The fear that without clarity, you'll fall apart. That without understanding, you'll lose yourself. But the truth is, the more you let go, the more yourself you become. Not the self you've tried to build, but the self that remains when all the trying stops. So now, as this chapter settles in, let clarity be what it is, not something to get, but something to meet. Not a prize, but a presence. Not a goal, but a gift. And let the desire to grasp it fall like a leaf from a quiet tree. You're not falling behind. You're already standing in the light you were chasing. And now, after traveling through stillness, silence, effort, and release, through breath, non-self, mindfulness, equanimity, and the middle way, something has shifted. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. The mind isn't buzzing like it used to. The body isn't chasing like it once did. The storm has quieted, not because life has changed, but because clarity has been remembered. A clarity that was never loud. A clarity that didn't need fixing, just space. You've seen that clarity doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from letting go of what blocks the knowing that's already inside you. You've seen that boredom is not the enemy. Urgency is not truth. Thought is not always guidance, and emptiness is not a void, but a mirror. A mirror that doesn't reflect what you expect, but what you are. Mental clarity isn't a destination, it's a way of relating. A way of meeting each moment with less noise and more honesty, less resistance and more attention, less grip and more grace. So, as you fall asleep tonight, know that you're not just resting your body, you're reconditioning your mind. You're leaving behind the heavy habits that confuse and replacing them with the gentle awareness that clears. And when you wake up, the world may still move quickly, but inside, you'll have a center that doesn't. If this brought you peace, insight, or stillness, let us know in the comments by writing, "Clarity begins within." It's a small phrase, but it might just mark the beginning of something big for you. And if you'd like to walk this path together, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell, so each time you return, the journey can continue, deeper, quieter, clearer. Until next time, breathe gently and rest well.